3 in the morning. Your eyes open to darkness. You try to sit up, but your body refuses the command. Your arms won't move. Your legs won't respond. You can't even turn your head. Panic floods through you as you realize something fundamental has broken in the connection between your mind and your flesh. Then you feel it. A presence. Something is in the room with you. You can't see it clearly, but you know it's there, watching from the corner, or standing at the foot of your bed, or worse, moving closer. Your chest tightens. Breathing becomes difficult, as if something heavy is pressing down on you. You want to scream, but your voice is as paralyzed as your limbs. All you can do is lie there, trapped inside your own body, while something unknowable shares your space in the dark. This moment, this exact terror, has visited humans for as long as we've been human. The details change across centuries and continents, but the experience remains hauntingly consistent. A person in ancient Mesopotamia woke to this same paralysis 4,000 years ago. A woman in medieval Europe felt this identical crushing weight. A man in feudal Japan sensed this precise malevolent presence. They had never heard of each other. Their cultures shared no contact, no trade routes, no exchange of stories. Yet they would describe their experiences in strikingly similar terms. Same immobility, same pressure, same sense of something hostile nearby. We call it sleep paralysis now. We have clinical definitions, neurological explanations, treatment protocols. We understand the mechanisms, but for most of human history, there was no neuroscience to explain why a healthy person would suddenly find themselves imprisoned in their own skin, while invisible entities pressed the breath from their lungs. So they created other explanations. Demons, witches, vengeful spirits, creatures of the night that fed on fear and life force. These weren't random superstitions dreamed up by primitive minds. They were logical frameworks built by intelligent people trying to make sense of a genuinely terrifying phenomenon that happened to them, to their families, to their neighbors, with disturbing regularity. What's remarkable isn't that different cultures invented supernatural explanations. What's remarkable is how similar those explanations became, despite vast separations of geography and time. Why did so many unconnected peoples describe a female entity, often aged, often malevolent, sitting on sleepers' chests? Why did the crushing sensation appear in accounts from Iceland to Indonesia? Why did the inability to cry out for help feature in medieval German folklore and ancient Chinese medical texts? These cultures couldn't have been copying each other. They were describing something real, something consistent, something built into the architecture of human consciousness itself. The mystery deepens when you realize this phenomenon crosses not just cultures, but centuries. It happens today with the same frequency and features it had 1,000 years ago. Modern people, armed with scientific knowledge about REM sleep and neural mechanisms, still wake in terror to presences that feel utterly real. Knowing it's your brain misfiring doesn't make the experience less visceral when you're in it. The demon might be made of neurons and neurotransmitters, rather than sulfur and malice. But in that moment, trapped and helpless, the distinction feels academic. So we're left with questions that span the entire human story. Why does this specific experience occur so consistently across all populations? What does it reveal about the human brain's relationship to fear, to consciousness, to the stories we tell ourselves about what's real? And perhaps most unsettling, if our ancestors were wrong about the demons but right about the terror, what else have we explained without truly understanding? The night holds many secrets. This is the story of one that has haunted us since the first human closed their eyes and couldn't open them again. The oldest written record of sleep paralysis sits in clay, pressed into existence by Mesopotamian hands around 2000 BCE. The cuneiform tablet describes nocturnal attacks by a demon called Lilitu, a female spirit who came in the darkness to sit upon sleepers and steal their breath. The symptoms recorded by ancient Sumerian scribes would be instantly recognizable to any modern sleep paralysis sufferer. Sudden waking, complete inability to move, crushing pressure on the chest, profound terror, and the overwhelming sense of a malevolent presence. They documented it not as myth, but as medical reality, something that required intervention, protection, ritual defense. The Babylonians inherited this knowledge and expanded it. Their texts describe Lilitu's male counterpart, Lilu, and an entire taxonomy of night demons with specific characteristics and preferred victims. Priests developed elaborate incantations meant to ward off these entities. Small clay tablets inscribed with protective spells were placed near beds. Amulets were worn during sleep. The civilization that gave us mathematics and astronomy, that tracked planetary movements with stunning accuracy, treated nighttime paralysis with the same seriousness they applied to any other observable, repeatable phenomenon. They were wrong about the cause, but they were meticulous about documenting the effects. Ancient Egypt left us different evidence, but described the same experience. Papyri from around 1500 BCE detail spells to protect against night crushers and malevolent spirits that immobilized sleepers. The god Bez, depicted as a dwarf-like figure with a lion's mane, was invoked specifically for bedroom protection. Egyptians positioned Bes figurines near sleeping areas, carved his image into headrests, and painted him on bedroom walls. The archaeological record shows this wasn't occasional practice, but standard procedure in homes across social classes. Whatever was happening in the night was common enough and terrifying enough to warrant permanent architectural and decorative responses. China's earliest medical texts, compiled around 400 BCE, document what they called ghost oppression. The description matches exactly what we now call sleep paralysis. The sleeper wakes but cannot move, feels pressure, senses a presence, experiences terror. Chinese physicians didn't categorize this as supernatural possession in the way later European cultures would. Instead, they treated it as a medical condition, with both physical and spiritual dimensions. Their recommended treatments combined herbal remedies, acupuncture points, sleeping position adjustments, and protective rituals. The framework was different from Mesopotamian demonology, but the underlying experience being described was identical. What makes these ancient accounts so compelling isn't just their age, but their specificity. These weren't vague references to bad dreams or restless nights. The descriptions include details that precisely match modern clinical presentations. The timing, typically during the transition between sleep states, the inability to speak or cry out, the sensation of pressure specifically on the chest, the feeling of suffocation, and remarkably, the awareness that one is awake but trapped. A Babylonian text describes the victim's eyes being open but the body frozen. An Egyptian spell mentions the terror of seeing but not acting. A Chinese medical document notes the mind's awareness contrasted with the body's refusal to obey. These early civilizations also documented patterns we still observe today. They noted that stress increased occurrences. They observed that sleeping on one's back seemed to trigger episodes more frequently. They recognized that certain individuals experienced this repeatedly while others never did. They understood it ran in families. Without brain scans or sleep laboratories, operating purely through careful observation across generations, they had identified risk factors and correlational patterns that modern sleep science would later confirm through controlled study. The geographical spread is equally striking. Beyond Mesopotamia, Egypt, and China, we find similar accounts in ancient Greek medical texts, early Indian Ayurvedic writings, pre-Columbian American oral traditions preserved in later colonial records, and across the ancient world, wherever writing systems allowed documentation, the experience was universal. The interpretations varied, reflecting each culture's cosmology and medical philosophy, but the core phenomenon remained constant. Something was happening to humans everywhere, something that transcended culture and geography, something woven into the very nature of human sleep and consciousness. Our ancestors didn't understand what it was, but they knew it was real, and they knew it demanded explanation. The explanations they created would shape societies, inspire terror, and occasionally cost lives. In the ancient world, there was no boundary between medicine and magic, no division between physical treatment and spiritual protection. The Egyptian physician who prescribed willow bark for pain also inscribed amulets with protective spells. The Chinese doctor who recommended herbal preparations equally valued the orientation of the sleeping chamber. The Greek Iatros, who understood humoral theory, still made offerings to Asclepius. For sleep paralysis and nighttime terrors, this integrated approach produced treatments that blended what we'd now call rational medicine with what we'd dismiss as pure superstition. Consider the Egyptian protocol for preventing nocturnal attacks. It involved sleeping with specific stones placed under the bed, consuming a paste made from particular herbs before sleep, positioning the bed to face certain directions, and reciting prayers to protective deities. Modern analysis reveals something fascinating. Several of the recommended herbs contained compounds with genuine sedative or anxiolytic properties. The sleeping positions they advocated, particularly avoiding lying flat on the back, align with contemporary sleep medicine recommendations for reducing sleep paralysis episodes. The stones accomplished nothing supernatural, but the ritual of placement may have created a psychological sense of safety that reduced anxiety-driven occurrences. Greek physicians like Galen proposed explanations rooted in their understanding of bodily humours. They believed nighttime paralysis resulted from an imbalance, typically excess of black bile or phlegm, affecting the brain during sleep. Their treatments included dietary modifications, exercise regimens, and sleeping environment adjustments. Some of these interventions, viewed through a modern lens, were surprisingly sound. Avoiding heavy meals before sleep, maintaining regular sleep schedules, ensuring proper ventilation in sleeping chambers, these recommendations appear in current sleep hygiene protocols. The theoretical framework was wrong, but the practical applications sometimes stumbled into effectiveness. Chinese traditional medicine approached the problem through its own systematic framework of qi, meridians, and organ systems. Practitioners identified specific acupuncture points believed to address sleep disturbances and paralysis. They prescribed herbal formulas tailored to individual constitutional types. They emphasized the importance of sleep timing aligned with natural cycles. Modern research on some traditional Chinese herbal preparations has identified active compounds with genuine effects on sleep architecture and anxiety reduction. The meridian theory doesn't match anatomical reality, yet stimulation of certain points does produce measurable physiological changes. What united these diverse medical traditions was the assumption that nighttime paralysis had causes that could be addressed through intervention. Whether those causes were demonic, humoral, or energetic, the response was systematic treatment rather than passive acceptance. Ancient healers were empiricists, working with flawed models. They observed what seemed to help, even if their explanations for why it helped were entirely wrong. Some treatments were useless or harmful. Others worked despite being justified by incorrect theories. A few accidentally discovered genuine interventions that modern science would later validate through different reasoning. The lesson isn't that ancient medicine was secretly correct all along. It's that humans have always sought to transform helplessness into agency, to find patterns in chaos, and to develop responses to suffering, even when understanding was incomplete. The boundary between medicine and magic only appeared later, as we learned to distinguish correlation from causation and developed methods to test mechanisms. But the impulse to treat, to protect, to find solutions that's been constant since the first terrified sleeper woke paralyzed and someone said, "Here, try this." She appears in the darkness with remarkable consistency. An old woman, withered, malevolent. She comes when you're most vulnerable, in those hours when sleep should bring rest but instead brings terror. In medieval Iceland, they called her the Mara. In Slavic lands, the Mora. German folklore named her the Nachzera. In Newfoundland, settlers spoke simply of the old hag. Half a world away in Japan, the experience was called Kanashibari, though the entity took different form. The names changed. The languages were unrelated. Yet the core image remained. Something feminine, something aged, something that sat upon your chest and stole your breath while you lay helpless beneath her weight. The Nordic Mara was particularly detailed in folklore. She was said to ride sleepers like horses, pressing down on their chests, tangling their hair, leaving them exhausted and terrified by morning. Protection required specific rituals. Iron placed under the pillow, shoes positioned with toes pointing away from the bed, certain herbs hung above doorways. The Mara could supposedly enter through keyholes, slip through the smallest cracks, transform herself to gain entry to locked chambers. She was persistent, returning night after night to her chosen victims unless powerful countermeasures were employed. The folklore emphasized her selectivity. She targeted particular individuals, often those who had somehow offended her or whose weakness she could sense. Slavic traditions described the Mora in strikingly similar terms, despite geographical separation from Nordic peoples. She crushed sleepers, caused nightmares, and left physical marks that victims would discover upon waking. Bruises, scratches, exhaustion so profound it seemed life force itself had been drained. The Mora could be a living witch projecting her spirit during sleep, or a supernatural entity independent of human form. Either way, she was female, she was dangerous, and she was real enough that communities developed elaborate protective systems. Some traditions held that if you could turn her, even slightly, during an attack, she would be forced to reveal herself and lose her power. German Nachtschere folklore added another dimension. These entities were sometimes former humans, particularly those who died violently or improperly. They returned to torment the living, feeding on life energy through nocturnal attacks. The Nachtschere supposedly chewed on her own burial shroud underground, and with each bite, a sleeping person above ground would feel the crushing pressure, the inability to breathe, the terror of invisible assault. The solution required finding the grave and placing coins in the corpse's mouth, or stones under the chin to prevent the chewing. It sounds absurd until you consider what it represents. A community trying to create actionable responses to a phenomenon that felt utterly real and desperately needed explanation. Why the feminine? Why specifically the aged feminine? Theories abound, and none fully satisfy. Some scholars point to anxieties around female sexuality and power, particularly postmenopausal women who no longer fit conventional reproductive roles and thus became culturally ambiguous and threatening. Others note the historical association between midwifery and life-death boundaries. Older women who attended births and deaths possessed knowledge that inspired both respect and fear. The crone archetype appears across mythologies as keeper of dangerous wisdom, dweller at thresholds between worlds. Sleep itself is a threshold state, and perhaps the night hag embodies the fear of what waits in that liminal space. Carl Jung would later propose that such figures represented archetypes within the collective unconscious universal symbols emerging independently across cultures because they tap into fundamental human psychological structures. The night hag as shadow self, as rejected feminine, as death incarnate. The theory suggests that cultures separated by oceans developed similar imagery because they were drawing from the same deep well of human consciousness. Whether you accept Jungian psychology or not, the pattern demands explanation. Why this specific image? Why not young women or men or shapeless terrors? Why did so many cultures independently settle on the aged female as the face of nocturnal paralysis? The real-world consequences were devastating for actual women. Those who fit the physical description, elderly, perhaps living alone, maybe practicing herbalism or midwifery, became targets of suspicion when neighbors reported nighttime attacks. In communities where belief in the night hag was strong, accusations could lead to ostracism, violence, or execution. The neurological phenomenon experienced by sleepers became a social weapon against vulnerable women. The hag was imaginary, but the women burned as witches were real. The demons sat on chests in hallucinations, but human hands built the pyres. Every folklore figure has a body count, and the night hag's ledger runs deep with the names of women who died because someone woke, paralyzed, and needed someone to blame. Medieval Europe transformed sleep paralysis into something even darker than simple demonic attack. The church documented thousands of cases involving incubi male demons who assaulted women in their sleep and succubi female demons who visited men. These weren't mere presences or crushing weights. The accounts describe experiences of profound sexual violation, detailed in church records and theological treatises with disturbing specificity. Women reported being held down, penetrated, their bodies responding despite their conscious horror and inability to resist. Men described seduction followed by overwhelming shame, their bodies participating in acts, their paralyzed wills condemned. The theological implications obsessed medieval scholars. Could a demon actually impregnate a woman? Church authorities debated earnestly. The prevailing theory, elaborated by Thomas Aquinas and others, held that a demon could collect semen while appearing as a succubus to a man, then use that seed while appearing as an incubus to a woman. Thus demon-facilitated conception might occur without the demon possessing generative power itself. The logic was intricate, the debate serious, the consequences severe. Women who claimed incubus attacks and later showed signs of pregnancy faced accusations ranging from demonic consort to simple adultery using supernatural excuse. Either way, the judgment was harsh. The accounts themselves, read today, clearly describe sleep paralysis combined with hypnagogic hallucinations of sexual content. The paralysis, the sense of presence, the feeling of pressure on the body, the inability to resist or cry out, these are textbook sleep paralysis features. The sexual component likely arose from the intersection of REM sleep's physical arousal, cultural frameworks that interpreted nocturnal experiences through religious lenses, and the brain's tendency to pattern hallucinations after culturally available imagery. In a society saturated with teachings about demons and sexual sin, where sexuality itself was deeply controlled and guilt-laden, the paralyzed sleeping brain had ready templates for the entities it would construct. But dismissing these as just hallucinations misses something crucial about the genuine trauma involved. These people experienced what felt absolutely real. The violation felt physical. The terror was authentic. The shame and confusion afterward were profound. Modern sleep paralysis sufferers sometimes report similar sexual content in their episodes, though the imagery now more often involves human intruders rather than demons. The neurological mechanism is identical. Only the cultural framing has shifted. What changes across time and culture is not the experience itself, but the story we tell about it. And that story profoundly affects how traumatic the experience becomes. The Church's response combined pastoral care with inquisitorial suspicion. Some priests were sympathetic, treating incubus reports as genuine demonic harassment, requiring prayer and protection. Others saw claims of demonic assault as potential evidence of witchcraft. Perhaps the victim had invited the demon through sin or pact. Trial records show sleep paralysis testimony, appearing as evidence in witchcraft cases, both as supposed proof of the accused's demonic associations and as experiences reported by accusers. The line between victim and perpetrator blurred dangerously. A woman reporting repeated incubus attacks might be pitied initially, but if the attacks continued despite exorcism and prayer, suspicion could shift. Why would demons so persistently target her unless she was somehow complicit? Islamic tradition developed parallel concepts with jinn, supernatural beings created from smokeless fire who could interact with humans in various ways, including sexually. Accounts of jinn-caused sleep paralysis appear in historical, Islamic, medical, and religious texts. The jinn were more complex than simple demons, capable of good or evil, some accepting Islam and others rebelling against divine order. The tradition acknowledged that jinn might attack during sleep, and protective prayers and Quranic verses were prescribed as defense. The framework differed from Christian demonology, but the underlying experiences being described matched remarkably. Paralysis, presence, pressure, violation. Hindu and Buddhist traditions also documented entities that attacked or seduced during sleep. Rakshasas in Hindu mythology could take beautiful forms to seduce humans or terrorize them in nightmares. Certain Buddhist texts describe Mara, a term related to the Nordic Mara, by linguistic coincidence, as forces of temptation and delusion that could manifest in sleep states. The tantric traditions of both religions developed complex understandings of sleep experiences, sometimes viewing them as opportunities for spiritual development rather than purely negative attacks. What unites these diverse traditions is the recognition that sleep paralysis experiences often carried sexual dimensions and caused profound distress beyond simple fear. The paralyzed state, combined with dreamlike imagery, created experiences that felt like violations of bodily autonomy. The cultural frameworks people use to interpret these experiences — Christian demonology, Islamic jinn tradition, Hindu mythology — shaped both the content of hallucinations and the social consequences of reporting them. The demons were projections, yes, but projections of real neurological events filtered through cultural lenses. Understanding that both elements are real, the brain state and the cultural construction, is essential to understanding why these beliefs persisted so powerfully and why they caused such harm to those caught between supernatural interpretation and neurological reality. Not every culture ran from the paralysis. Not every tradition interpreted the crushing weight and spectral presence as attack. In some societies, what we call sleep paralysis was understood as communication, calling, or blessing. The immobility became doorway rather than trap. The presence became messenger rather than demon. The difference wasn't in the neurological phenomenon that remained constant, but in the interpretive framework that determined whether the experience meant terror or transcendence. Certain indigenous American traditions viewed sleep paralysis through shamanic lenses. Among some peoples, the experience of waking unable to move while sensing presences could indicate spiritual calling. The individual wasn't being attacked but contacted. Animal spirits, ancestors, or other than human persons were attempting communication, and the paralyzed state represented the threshold between ordinary consciousness and spiritual awareness. Those who experienced this repeatedly, rather than being cursed or demon-harassed, might be recognized as having shamanic potential. The inability to move wasn't imprisonment, but the necessary stillness required to receive messages beyond normal perception. The response to such experiences was therefore not protective ritual to ward them off, but training to navigate them skillfully. Young people showing signs of frequent sleep paralysis might be mentored by experienced practitioners who taught techniques for remaining calm during episodes, for interpreting the imagery that appeared, for transforming terror into communication. The goal wasn't elimination of the experience, but transformation of relationship to it. Where European culture sought exorcism, these traditions sought engagement. African diaspora traditions carried similar frameworks across the Middle Passage and into the Americas. In some communities, sleep paralysis could indicate ancestral contact or spiritual possession of positive rather than negative nature. Being ridden during sleep might mean ancestral spirits were claiming you for service, marking you as medium or healer. The crushing sensation was the weight of spiritual responsibility, and resisting it only made the experience worse. Acceptance, learning to breathe through it, allowing the presence rather than fighting it. These were the taught responses. The tradition acknowledged the fear, but reframed it as the natural response to encountering power beyond ordinary experience. Hindu and Buddhist traditions, with their sophisticated understanding of consciousness states, sometimes categorized sleep paralysis as a meditation-adjacent phenomenon. Certain yogic practices deliberately cultivated similar states' conscious awareness while the body entered deep relaxation. Sleep paralysis, in this view, was an uncontrolled version of what meditators learned to navigate deliberately. The presence sensed during episodes might be thought forms, energetic patterns, or aspects of one's own consciousness normally hidden. Rather than demonic attack, the experience revealed layers of mind, usually inaccessible. Some practitioners reportedly sought to induce similar states as part of dream yoga practices, using the threshold between waking and sleeping for spiritual development. The critical question these traditions raise is whether expectation and interpretation actually change the subjective quality of the experience. Modern research suggests the answer is yes, at least partially. Studies comparing sleep paralysis experiences across cultures show that while the basic features remain constant, the emotional intensity and lasting psychological impact vary significantly. In cultures where the experience has positive or neutral interpretations, people report less fear during episodes and less trauma afterward. In cultures emphasizing demonic interpretation, the fear amplifies and the experience becomes more distressing. This doesn't mean one interpretation is objectively correct and others wrong. The neurology is what it is. REM atonia, persisting into partial waking, brain areas generating sense of presence, anxiety circuits activating. But human experience isn't purely neurological. It's neurological events interpreted through cultural frameworks, and those frameworks profoundly shape what the experience feels like from inside. The demon and the ancestor might both be hallucinations generated by the same brain mechanisms, but the sleeper who expects an ancestor may navigate the experience with curiosity rather than terror, may breathe slowly rather than panic, may emerge feeling contacted rather than attacked. Same neurons, different meaning. Same paralysis, different relationship. The brain creates the experience, but culture provides the story, and the story shapes the experience in return. Walk through a traditional Chinese home from the Ming dynasty, and you'll notice the bedroom faces specific directions, never certain orientations considered vulnerable to spiritual intrusion. The bed itself sits at a particular angle, never directly aligned with the door, positioned to prevent entities from having straight access to the sleeper. Windows are sized and placed according to principles that balance ventilation with protection. These weren't aesthetic choices. They were defensive architecture against nocturnal attack, designed as carefully as fortifications against human enemies. Medieval European bedrooms tell similar stories in different languages. The four-poster bed wasn't originally a status symbol, but a protective enclosure. Heavy curtains created a room within a room, a defended space that could be sealed against night visitors, both physical and supernatural. Bed designs incorporated Christian symbols, protective carvings, specific woods believed to ward off evil. The headboard wasn't decorative flourish but barrier. Some wealthy homes featured bedrooms designed with multiple doors to confuse demons, or windows positioned to allow blessed moonlight but prevent shadow entry. The architecture embodied the theology of spiritual warfare. Islamic architectural traditions developed their own protective systems. Bedrooms in traditional homes incorporated specific design elements meant to guard against jinn during sleep. Quranic verses were carved into door frames and window borders. Room proportions followed sacred geometry principles believed to create spiritually harmonious space. Sleeping areas were positioned within homes according to directional principles, and certain architectural features were standard specifically for nocturnal protection. The integration of spiritual defense into built environment wasn't superstitious addition, but fundamental design principle. Japanese architectural traditions approach sleep space with similar seriousness. Traditional rooms featured elements specifically related to sleep protection and spiritual cleanliness. The tokonoma alcove, the careful orientation of sleeping areas, the specific materials chosen for tatami and sleeping platforms, these reflected understanding that the sleeping state required environmental support. Protective amulets were standard household items, positioned in bedrooms as routinely as we might install smoke detectors today. The architecture acknowledged that sleep brought vulnerability requiring structural response. What's fascinating is how many of these superstitious design elements accidentally improved sleep quality through entirely material mechanisms. The Chinese feng shui principle of not aligning beds directly with doors? Modern sleep science confirms that avoiding direct airflow pathways and maintaining indirect light helps regulate sleep. The Islamic emphasis on room proportions and natural ventilation creates optimal temperature and air quality for sleep. The European enclosed bed with heavy curtains blocks light and sound while creating microclimate that enhances sleep stability. The Japanese attention to materials and cleanliness in sleeping spaces reduces allergens and creates psychological comfort conducive to rest. The protective symbols, the prayers carved in headboards, the specific compass orientations meant to confuse demons, these did nothing supernatural. But the attention to bedroom environment they represented, the care taken to make sleep space feel safe and properly designed, likely reduced anxiety and improved sleep quality. Better sleep meant fewer sleep disruptions, which meant reduced sleep paralysis occurrence. The mechanism was entirely natural, but the outcome matched the intention. They were protecting against demons that didn't exist, but the protection worked anyway by improving conditions that reduced the neurological events they interpreted as demonic. Archaeological evidence reveals just how widespread and serious these practices were. Excavations of homes across cultures and time periods consistently show bedroom spaces treated differently from other rooms. Special materials, protective symbols, deliberate orientations appear in dwellings from peasant huts to palaces. The consistency suggests this wasn't elite superstition, but universal concern. Everyone slept, everyone was vulnerable, and everyone sought architectural solutions to nocturnal threats. The economic investment was substantial. Families of modest means still purchased protective amulets, carved symbols into whatever furniture they could afford, oriented their sleeping spaces according to traditional principles, even when it sacrificed other conveniences. Wealthy families spent fortunes on elaborate bed structures, specialized bedroom architecture, commissioned protective carvings from skilled craftspeople. The cost reveals how serious the threat felt. You don't invest significant resources in defending against something you consider trivial. These architectural choices became so embedded in tradition that many persisted long after their original protective purpose was forgotten. Elements initially meant to ward off night demons became aesthetic preferences, cultural markers, traditional style, whose origins in supernatural defense faded from collective memory. We still orient beds thoughtfully, still value enclosed or protected sleeping spaces, still treat bedrooms as somehow special within the home. The demons are gone from our explanatory frameworks, but their influence remains literally built into our environments. Power flows toward those who control explanation. In societies where sleep paralysis was interpreted as supernatural attack, the authorities who could diagnose, treat, or prevent such attacks wielded significant influence. The priest who could perform protective rituals, the healer who knew the right incantations, the wise woman who prepared defensive amulets. These individuals held keys to safety in the vulnerable hours of night. That power could be used for community benefit, but it could also become weapon, tool of control, mechanism for enforcing orthodoxy and punishing deviation. The Catholic Church's monopoly on demon-related explanations in medieval Europe created a system where ecclesiastical authority extended into the most private sphere: the bedroom, the sleeping mind, the nocturnal experience. Only properly ordained clergy could perform effective exorcisms. Only church-approved prayers and rituals offered real protection. Alternative healers, traditional practitioners, anyone offering non-church sanctioned solutions risked accusations of trafficking with the very demons they claimed to combat. The church became gatekeeper between sleepers and safety, and that position generated both spiritual authority and material wealth through fees for services, sale of protective relics, and institutional power. But the politics ran deeper than institutional control. Sleep paralysis accusations became weapons in community conflicts. When someone reported nocturnal attacks, the question, "Who caused this?" invited finger-pointing with dangerous consequences. Old grudges, property disputes, social competitions, these could be prosecuted through supernatural channels. The widow who argued with her neighbor might find herself accused of sending nocturnal demons. The midwife who attended a difficult birth resulting in death might be blamed when the grieving father later experienced sleep paralysis he interpreted as the dead child's spirit. The herbalist whose remedies competed with church-sanctioned cures could be identified as source rather than solution for nighttime afflictions. Trial records from the European witch hunts reveal sleep paralysis testimony appearing with disturbing frequency. Accusers described being paralyzed in bed, sensing a presence, feeling crushing pressure, sometimes seeing the accused person's face or spirit in the room. This testimony was taken as evidence of witchcraft, of astral projection, of malicious intent manifested through supernatural means. The neurological phenomenon in the accuser's brain became legal evidence against the accused's body. Judges who wouldn't accept hearsay or rumor gave weight to sleep paralysis accounts, treating them as eyewitness testimony of supernatural crime. The patterns of accusation reveal the social dynamics at play. The accused were disproportionately women, particularly those who existed outside patriarchal protection. Widows, single women, those too old for childbearing, the economically independent. They were often the poor accused by those with more resources, the socially marginal targeted by the central. They were religious minorities, ethnic outsiders, those who had somehow offended community norms. Sleep paralysis provided the perfect accusation because it couldn't be disproven. The accused couldn't demonstrate they weren't sending their spirits to attack the accuser's sleep. The evidence was the accuser's subjective experience, and that was unassailable. Some individuals learned to weaponize their own experiences strategically. Claiming to be attacked by a specific person's spirit could eliminate a rival, settle a score, or gain attention and sympathy. In communities where such claims were taken seriously, they became tools of social manipulation. Genuine sleep paralysis experiences were real enough, but the interpretation of who caused them could be deployed tactically. The result was communities caught in cycles of accusation and counter-accusation, where neurological events became ammunition in social warfare. Yet, there was also resistance, though it was dangerous. Some authorities questioned whether sleep experiences constituted reliable evidence. Some communities protected accused individuals, refusing to participate in prosecutions based on nocturnal testimony. Some traditional healers continued their work despite church opposition, maintaining alternative frameworks for understanding and treating sleep disturbances. These resistances were often subtle, indirect, cloaked in acceptable language, but they represented refusal to surrender all authority to official interpretations. The eventual decline of supernatural prosecutions came partially from changing explanatory frameworks. As scientific and medical models gained credibility, sleep paralysis began migrating from theological to medical category. The shift didn't eliminate power dynamics. Medical authorities would establish their own gatekeeping over sleep disorders, but it did reduce the deadliest consequences. You could be diagnosed rather than executed, treated rather than burned. The politics of explanation continued, but the body count decreased. What remains uncomfortable is recognizing how easily neurological experiences became social weapons, how readily genuine suffering was weaponized against vulnerable populations. The sleep paralysis itself was real, the terror authentic, but the system that transformed personal experience into evidence for capital crimes was purely social construction. The demons were hallucinations, but the pyres were material fact. The night hag existed only in neurons, but the women hanged as witches died in the world we all share. Between 1450 and 1750, Europe executed an estimated 40,000 to 60,000 people as witches. The true number is unknown and likely higher, as many executions went unrecorded and countless victims died in prison, awaiting trial. Sleep paralysis testimony appears in trial after trial, accusation after accusation, a pattern running through the records like dark thread through tapestry. We have their names. We know their stories. We can read what they said happened in the night, the experiences that sealed their fates. Take the case of Alcée Young, hanged in Connecticut in 1647, the first person executed for witchcraft in the American colonies. The fragmentary records suggest accusations involved nighttime afflictions befalling her accusers, descriptions consistent with sleep paralysis. She had no defense against testimony that others woke paralyzed and sensed her presence. Her body hangs in history as monument to the human cost of these supernatural interpretations. Or consider the Basque witch trials of 1609 to 1614, where over 7,000 people were accused and hundreds executed. The accusations centered heavily on nocturnal attacks, people reporting being held down in bed, unable to move or speak, aware of witches in the room performing rituals. Mass psychology, sleep disturbances, and cultural frameworks for interpretation combined into catastrophic witch panic. The trials only ended when a skeptical inquisitor, Alonso de Salazar Frias, investigated and concluded the accusations lacked credible evidence. His intervention saved lives, but not those already burned. The Salem witch trials of 1692 provide the most documented American example. Multiple accusers described nocturnal attacks matching sleep paralysis, lying unable to move while spectral shapes of the accused appeared and tormented them. 20 people were executed, more died in prison, lives and community destroyed by events that began with girls experiencing what was likely combination of sleep paralysis, social pressure, and escalating hysteria. The trials eventually ended when accusations began reaching too high in social hierarchy, threatening elite citizens whose status offered protection the initial victims lacked. But execution wasn't the only cost. Countless people were imprisoned, tortured during interrogation, had property confiscated, families destroyed, reputations annihilated. Even those eventually released often returned to ruined lives. The social death that preceded or replaced physical death was itself profound punishment for experiences they didn't cause and couldn't control. Communities fractured under the weight of these accusations. Neighbor turned against neighbor, families divided, trust evaporated. Some areas became so consumed by witch panic that normal social function broke down. The search for supernatural explanations of sleep paralysis created cultures of suspicion where any misfortune could be attributed to witchcraft, any person vulnerable to accusation, any relationship poisoned by potential suspicion. The attempted cures themselves caused suffering. Exorcisms could be brutal, involving physical restraint, beatings, near drowning, forced consumption of disgusting substances. Those identified as possessed or afflicted sometimes endured treatments as traumatic as the original sleep paralysis experiences. The cure became another form of torture, justified by religious authority, but causing genuine harm to people seeking help for terrifying experiences they couldn't explain. Yet there were also those who resisted, who questioned, who saved lives by refusing to participate in prosecutions. The inquisitor, who demanded evidence, the judge, who insisted on material proof, the community that protected its own against outside accusers, the priest who treated possession, claims with skepticism and mercy rather than fire. These individuals existed, their acts of resistance documented alongside the persecutions. They remind us that even in darkest times, alternate interpretations were possible. Compassion could override fear, reason could challenge superstition. The body count stands as a reminder of what happens when we lack frameworks for understanding our own neurology, when we outsource explanation to authorities with vested interests, when we allow subjective experiences to become evidence for harming others. The sleep paralysis hasn't changed across centuries. Human brains still produce these experiences with the same frequency and features. What changed was how we interpret them, who has authority over interpretation, and what consequences flow from those interpretations. The demons killed no one. Belief in demons killed thousands. In 1025, a Persian physician named Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, wrote something that could have gotten him killed. In his medical encyclopedia, The Canon of Medicine, he suggested that experiences attributed to demonic attack might originate within the body and mind, rather than from external supernatural forces. He proposed that imbalances of bodily humors, when affecting the brain during sleep, could create sensations of pressure, paralysis, and perceived presences. The demons, he carefully suggested, might be products of the afflicted person's own imagination, disturbed by physiological dysfunction. This was radical, not because it was entirely new. Greek physicians had proposed natural explanations centuries earlier, but because it was being stated in an Islamic context where jinn were doctrinally real, and more importantly, because Avicenna's work would become foundational medical text for both Islamic and European physicians for the next 600 years. He walked a careful line, never denying the possibility of actual supernatural causes, but suggesting that in many cases, natural explanations should be considered first. His influence meant that at least some physicians, in some places, would approach sleep paralysis as medical condition rather than religious matter. Ancient Greek physicians had indeed preceded him. Galen, writing in the 2nd century, had attributed nightmares and sleep disturbances to physical causes, digestive issues, humoral imbalances, brain inflammations. He documented that certain foods seemed to trigger nightmares, that stress and anxiety worsened sleep disturbances, that sleep position affected occurrence of nocturnal afflictions. His framework was wrong in specifics but right in principle. These were medical phenomena with natural causes amenable to medical intervention. Yet even these early skeptics faced limitations. Questioning supernatural explanations was professionally and personally dangerous. Religious authorities controlled much of medical practice and could destroy careers or lives of those who strayed too far from orthodoxy. Early scientific thinkers learned to frame their naturalistic explanations carefully, often allowing for both natural and supernatural causes operating simultaneously, or suggesting that demons might work through natural mechanisms. The rhetorical gymnastics required to pursue empirical observation while avoiding heresy charges were elaborate. Some paid the price for insufficient caution. Girolamo Cardano, an Italian Renaissance physician and mathematician, argued too forcefully in the 16th century that many supernatural experiences had natural explanations. He suggested that visions, possession, and nocturnal attacks could result from mental disturbances, dreams, or medical conditions. His works were placed on the Catholic Church's Index of Forbidden Books, and he spent time under house arrest. His son was executed for poisoning his wife, possibly with false charges motivated by the family's controversial reputation. Skepticism carried costs. Others were more strategic. Reginald Scott, writing in 1584, published The Discovery of Witchcraft, which argued that many supposed cases of witchcraft and demonic attack were actually cases of mental illness, fraud, or misunderstood natural phenomena. He documented sleep paralysis-like experiences and suggested naturalistic explanations. The book was ordered burned by King James I, but enough copies survived to influence later skeptical thinkers. Scott's work planted seeds of doubt that would eventually grow into systematic skepticism about supernatural explanations. The accumulation of skeptical voices created gradual shift. Each physician who documented natural patterns in sleep disturbances, each scholar who proposed mechanical explanations for apparently supernatural events, each anatomist who mapped the brain and found no seat for demons, these incrementally built foundation for alternative frameworks. The process took centuries, moved fitfully forward and backward, faced fierce resistance, and was never inevitable. What's striking about these early skeptics is their intellectual courage. They were operating with primitive tools, incomplete knowledge, and powerful opposition. They couldn't prove demons didn't exist, you can't prove a negative. But they could observe patterns, note correlations, and suggest that perhaps the simplest explanation wasn't invisible malevolent entities, but rather the complex, poorly understood machinery of human sleep and consciousness. They chose evidence over tradition, observation over authority, curiosity over certainty. Their questions mattered more than their answers, and their willingness to question authority created space for the scientific investigation of sleep that would eventually follow. For most of human history, sleep was a black box. People closed their eyes, lost consciousness, sometimes dreamed, and woke hours later. What happened during those dark hours remained mystery. The sleeping body could be observed breathing, occasional movements, shifting positions, but the sleeping mind was inaccessible. Without tools to measure brain activity, without frameworks for understanding consciousness states, sleep research was limited to external observation and sleeper self-reports. The first systematic attempts to study sleep emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries. Researchers measured breathing rates, pulse, and body temperature during sleep, discovering that these varied across the night in patterns. The observations were crude but revealing. Sleep wasn't uniform, unconsciousness but dynamic process with measurable changes. Something was happening in there, even if they couldn't yet determine what. The breakthrough came in 1924, when German psychiatrist Hans Berger invented the electroencephalogram, the EEG. For the first time in human history, the electrical activity of the living brain could be measured and recorded. Berger initially kept his discovery secret, fearing ridicule, but when he finally published his findings, he revolutionized neuroscience. The EEG revealed that the brain during sleep wasn't simply off, but showed complex, organized electrical patterns that changed across the night. Early EEG studies quickly identified distinct patterns of brain activity. Researchers noticed that the brain waves of sleeping individuals cycled through different stages, each with characteristic electrical signatures. They could distinguish light sleep from deep sleep, could identify transitions, could begin mapping the night's neurological landscape. But the most startling discovery came in 1953, when Eugene Aserinsky, a graduate student working in Nathaniel Kleitman's sleep laboratory at the University of Chicago, was monitoring his 8-year-old son's sleep. Aserinsky noticed something impossible. His sleeping son's eyes were moving rapidly beneath his closed eyelids, while the EEG showed a brain pattern that looked almost like waking. This wasn't supposed to happen. During deep sleep, eyes didn't move much, and brain activity was slow, synchronized. But here was a sleep stage, with brain activity resembling wakefulness, combined with rapid eye movements. Further research revealed this stage occurred cyclically throughout the night, lasting longer in later cycles. They called it REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. The discovery of REM sleep was the key that unlocked understanding of dreams, and eventually, sleep paralysis. Researchers soon established that most vivid dreaming occurred during REM sleep. They found that during REM, the brain was highly active while the body was paralyzed, a condition they termed REM atonia, designed to prevent sleepers from physically acting out their dreams. The paralysis was protective, keeping people from injuring themselves or others while their brains generated intense dream experiences. But what happened if someone partially woke during REM sleep? The brain might become conscious while the body remained paralyzed. The person would be awake, aware, but unable to move. And because the brain regions generating dream imagery might still be active, hallucinations could occur, the sense of presence, the visual or auditory experiences, the feelings of terror that accompanied many episodes. For the first time, science could explain the mechanics of sleep paralysis. The following decades saw explosion of sleep research. Scientists mapped sleep cycles with increasing precision, identified the neurochemicals involved in regulating sleep and wakefulness, discovered that different brain regions showed different activity patterns during different sleep stages. They learned that sleep wasn't one state but many states, each serving different functions. They identified how sleep deprivation affected the brain, how stress influenced sleep architecture, why some people were more prone to sleep disturbances. The technology continued advancing. Brain imaging techniques like fMRI allowed researchers to see which brain areas activated during different sleep stages. They could watch in real time, as the brain transitioned between states, could identify which circuits controlled the paralysis, which regions generated sense of presence, which pathways mediated fear responses. Sleep paralysis became visible not just in its subjective effects, but in its objective neural correlates. Yet even as the mapping advanced, mystery remained. Researchers could describe what happened during sleep paralysis, but still struggled with why it happened to some people frequently and others never. They could identify risk factors, but couldn't fully predict occurrence. They understood mechanisms, but not all the triggers. The night had been partially illuminated, but shadows persisted in the landscape they revealed. Science had transformed sleep from complete mystery to partial mystery progress, certainly. But the journey toward full understanding was far from over. Modern neuroscience can explain sleep paralysis with precision that would astound our ancestors. The mechanism is clear. During REM sleep, the brainstem sends signals that effectively paralyze the skeletal muscles, preventing the body from acting out dreams. This REM atonia is essential. Without it, people thrash violently during vivid dreams, potentially injuring themselves or bed partners. It's protective feature, not malfunction. But sometimes, consciousness returns before the paralysis ends. The person wakes mentally while remaining physically immobilized. That's sleep paralysis. The sense of presence, the feeling that someone or something is in the room, comes from hyperactivity in brain regions involved in threat detection. The amygdala, our fear center, activates intensely. Areas responsible for detecting agents and intentionality fire without appropriate external stimuli. The brain, trying to make sense of these signals, constructs an explanation. There must be someone there. The crushing sensation on the chest results from heightened awareness of breathing difficulty caused by remaining in the REM breathing pattern while partly conscious. The brain interprets restricted breathing as external pressure. The hallucinations that often accompany sleep paralysis, visual, auditory, tactile, arise from continuing activity in brain regions that generate dream imagery. These hypnagogic or hypnopompic hallucinations occur during transitions between sleep and waking. The paralyzed person experiencing them can't easily distinguish them from reality, because the brain systems that normally help us differentiate dreaming from waking aren't fully engaged. Scientists have even induced sleep paralysis in laboratory settings by manipulating sleep schedules, positioning, and wake timing. They can trigger episodes, measure the exact brain activity involved, and map the neural circuits responsible. They understand which neurotransmitters are involved: acetylcholine, GABA, others. They know that sleep deprivation increases occurrence, that sleeping on your back raises likelihood, that stress and anxiety are significant risk factors. The phenomenon has been thoroughly demystified. Except here's what science still can't fully explain. Why does the brain create specifically malevolent presences? The threat detection system activating makes sense, evolutionarily better to perceive threats that aren't there than miss threats that are. But why not benevolent presences? Why not neutral presences? Why does the sleep-paralyzed brain so consistently generate entities that feel hostile, threatening, evil? The standard answer involves the amygdala's involvement and fear's evolutionary priority. But that doesn't fully explain the consistency of malevolence across cultures and individuals. And why do the hallucinations have such consistent themes, even when people have never heard of sleep paralysis or cultural demons? The shadow figure in the corner, the sense of something approaching the bed, the feeling of being watched, these appear independently in people worldwide. Cultural conditioning shapes the specific imagery. Somewhat Christian sleepers might see demons. Contemporary sleepers might see intruders or aliens. but the core pattern of threatening presence persists across variations. Is it purely neural architecture, all humans sharing similar brain structures that generate similar hallucinations under similar conditions? Or is there something about the sleep paralysis state that channels consciousness toward particular experiences? Research continues, exploring genetic factors. Sleep paralysis runs in families, suggesting hereditary components not yet fully understood. Studies investigate why some people experience isolated episodes, while others suffer frequent recurrences. Scientists examine the relationship between sleep paralysis and other conditions like narcolepsy, anxiety disorders, and PTSD, finding connections but not complete explanations. The scientific explanation is robust, evidence-based, and vastly better than demons did it. But honest scientists acknowledge what they don't know. Why this particular experience? Why such consistency across the species? Why does understanding the mechanism not eliminate the terror for those experiencing it? The brain creating its own demons is, in its way, as strange as supernatural demons would be. We've replaced mystery with knowledge, but the knowledge reveals new mysteries about consciousness, fear, and the peculiar ways neural circuits can trap us in our own minds. We understand sleep paralysis. We just don't understand everything about why it is the way it is. In 2015, researchers compiled data from 36,533 people across 35 countries, creating the largest cross-cultural study of sleep paralysis ever conducted. The numbers revealed patterns both expected and surprising. Approximately 20 to 40% of respondents reported experiencing sleep paralysis at least once in their lives, but the distribution wasn't even. Some populations showed rates exceeding 50%. Others fell below 10%. The variation demanded explanation. Asian countries, particularly Cambodia and Japan, showed significantly higher reported rates. Nearly half of Cambodian respondents reported sleep paralysis experiences. In Japan, the phenomenon was common enough to have entered everyday language kanashibari, literally bound or fastened in metal, a term most Japanese people immediately recognize. Researchers investigating these elevated rates found correlations with sleep patterns, cultural attitudes toward sleep, work schedules, and interestingly, how the experiences were interpreted. In Cambodia, sleep paralysis was often attributed to spirits of the dead, particularly victims of the Khmer Rouge genocide. The cultural framework for understanding these experiences was specific, traumatic, deeply embedded in collective memory. Yet the same study found that Cambodians who had immigrated to Western countries maintained higher rates than their adopted countries' populations, suggesting both genetic, cultural factors persisted across geography and that the interpretive framework remained stable even when dominant culture changed. College students worldwide showed elevated rates. The correlation with irregular sleep schedules was clear, pulling all-nighters, shifting sleep times dramatically, chronic sleep deprivation all increased occurrence. Shift workers showed similar patterns. Anyone whose lifestyle disrupted normal circadian rhythms faced higher risk. The modern world, with its 24-hour economies and contempt for regular sleep, was essentially creating conditions that triggered sleep paralysis more frequently than in earlier eras, with more stable sleep patterns. Stress proved to be a powerful predictor. Respondents reporting high anxiety or major life stressors showed dramatically higher rates. PTSD sufferers experienced sleep paralysis at rates several times the general population. The connection between psychological state and occurrence was undeniable, yet the causation ran both directions. Stress triggered sleep paralysis, but repeated sleep paralysis experiences created their own trauma and anxiety, establishing vicious cycles. What surprised researchers was how interpretation affected ongoing experience. Respondents who understood sleep paralysis in neurological terms reported less fear during episodes and less lasting distress afterward, compared to those who maintained supernatural interpretations. Knowledge didn't prevent the experience, but it moderated the emotional impact. Simply knowing, this is my brain, this will pass, I'm not in danger, changed the subjective quality of the event. But that knowledge wasn't universal protection. Many respondents who intellectually accepted the scientific explanation still experienced profound terror during episodes. Knowing the demon is hallucination doesn't make it feel less real when it's sitting on your chest at 3 in the morning. The gap between intellectual understanding and emotional experience remained vast. One respondent described it perfectly. "I know it's not real, but my body doesn't know that. My fear doesn't care about neuroscience." The survey also revealed that many people experiencing sleep paralysis never mentioned it to anyone. They didn't report it to doctors, didn't discuss it with family, carried these frightening experiences in silence. Some feared being thought crazy. Others didn't realize it was common enough to have a name. The isolation compounded the distress. Those who did seek medical help often found physicians unfamiliar with the condition or dismissive of its impact. The gap between scientific understanding and clinical practice was significant. Online communities had begun changing this landscape. Respondents increasingly reported learning about sleep paralysis through internet research, finding others with similar experiences, discovering they weren't alone or crazy. The democratization of medical information was helping, though it also introduced new confusions, as people encountered both accurate scientific explanations and supernatural interpretations with equal digital authority. The modern experience of sleep paralysis was being shaped by technology in ways previous generations never encountered, creating new forms of shared experience and new frameworks for interpretation, alongside the ancient terrors that persisted, regardless of how we tried to explain them. The Hat Man has no origin story, no ancient mythology, no traditional folklore. He appeared in the 21st century, born on internet forums and shared through digital networks. Thousands of people, independently, began reporting the same entity during sleep paralysis. A tall shadow figure, wearing a wide-brimmed hat, standing silently in doorways or at the foot of beds. The descriptions matched with unsettling precision. Not just a shadow person, specifically a shadow person wearing a hat, always watching, always silent, always bringing the same visceral dread. The phenomenon raises disturbing questions. These people hadn't coordinated their stories. Many reported the Hat Man before encountering others' descriptions online. They came from different countries, different backgrounds, different belief systems. Yet they saw the same figure, down to details like the hat's brim width and the entity's characteristic stillness. Traditional explanations suggest cultural priming, perhaps exposure to similar imagery in media or collective unconscious archetypes. But the Hat Man's specificity and recent emergence complicate those explanations. Online communities have become laboratories for real-time mythology creation. The subreddit dedicated to sleep paralysis has hundreds of thousands of members sharing experiences, offering support, comparing entities they've encountered. Sorting by entity type reveals patterns: the shadow people, the old hag variations, the child figures, the animal presences. Users recognize these categories, report feeling validated when others describe identical experiences, sometimes express disappointment that their particular demon wasn't more original. The tone of these communities mixes terror with dark humor. Users share memes about sleep paralysis, create jokes about their recurring demons, develop informal competition over whose paralysis experiences are most bizarre. The humor serves defensive function, making the terrifying manageable through mockery, but also creates new relationship to the phenomenon. Where medieval victims had no community of fellow sufferers, modern experiencers find thousands of people who understand exactly what they're describing. YouTube testimonials bring visual dimension to shared experiences. Channels dedicated to paranormal content feature countless sleep paralysis accounts, many framed as evidence of supernatural phenomena, despite scientific explanations being readily available. The comment sections become spaces where scientific and supernatural interpretations collide, where experiencers debate whether to trust neuroscience or their own subjective certainty that something truly other was present. TikTok has accelerated and fragmented the discourse. Short videos dramatize sleep paralysis experiences, sometimes with recreations that blend horror entertainment with personal testimony. The algorithm ensures that once you watch one sleep paralysis video, dozens more appear, creating echo chambers where the phenomenon becomes increasingly normalized or, depending on the content consumed, increasingly terrifying. Younger users encountering sleep paralysis for the first time often turn to TikTok before medical resources, shaping their initial interpretation through whatever the algorithm serves them. This creates a fascinating feedback loop. As people consume digital content about sleep paralysis, they form expectations about what the experience involves. Those expectations potentially influence what they perceive during actual episodes. The brain, creating hallucinations from cultural material, now has Internet's vast repository to draw from. Someone who has seen hundreds of Hatman descriptions might be more likely to hallucinate that specific figure. The collective creation of demons through digital sharing could be influencing individual neurological experiences in real time. The Internet has also enabled detailed comparison across cultures that wasn't previously possible. Users from Japan describe kanashibari features, which users from Brazil recognize in their own experiences despite different cultural contexts. The conversation reveals both universal human neurology and cultural specificity in how that neurology manifests. The same brain mechanisms operate everywhere, but the entities they generate wear local clothing, speak local languages, embody local fears. Perhaps most significantly, digital communities have transformed sleep paralysis from isolated terror to shared phenomenon. The sleeper who wakes paralyzed and afraid can, within hours, find thousands of others who have experienced the same thing. The demon might be no less frightening, but the sufferer is no longer alone. That shift from isolation to community represents genuine change in how humans relate to this ancient experience, even as the experience itself remains fundamentally unchanged from what our ancestors endured millennia ago. Ask a neuroscientist what happens during sleep paralysis, and you'll get a clear answer. REM atonia, persisting into consciousness, threat detection systems activating inappropriately, hypnagogic hallucinations generated by continuing dream imagery. The explanation is thorough, evidence-based, mechanistically sound. Ask a devout believer of almost any faith, and you might get a different answer. Spiritual attack, demonic oppression, ancestral visitation, or karmic manifestation. The frameworks are incompatible in their fundamental assumptions about reality. Yet many individuals hold both simultaneously, without apparent contradiction. Modern religious communities have developed sophisticated integrations of scientific and spiritual understanding. Some Christian theologians propose that neuroscience describes the mechanism through which spiritual forces operate. Demons don't violate natural law, but work through it. And sleep paralysis represents a vulnerability in our neurological architecture that spiritual entities can exploit. The science explains how, without explaining why certain individuals are targeted. This framework allows believers to accept the neurological findings while maintaining their cosmology intact. Islamic scholars have similarly integrated jinn-related teachings with sleep science. The brain mechanisms are acknowledged as real. Allah created those mechanisms, but spiritual beings working within created order aren't excluded by natural explanations. Protective prayers function both spiritually and psychologically, reducing anxiety that exacerbates episodes while providing divine protection. The integration is seamless for believers because both natural and supernatural operate within the same divine creation. Buddhist and Hindu practitioners often find the integration even easier. Their traditions already contain sophisticated understandings of consciousness as primary reality. The brain is vehicle for consciousness, not its source in these frameworks. Sleep paralysis represents particular consciousness state with both neurological correlates and spiritual dimensions. Meditation practices that cultivate awareness during altered states aren't fundamentally different from being conscious during REM atonia. The neuroscience describes one level of reality. Spiritual practices engage another. What's striking is how satisfied people can be with multiple explanatory frameworks operating in parallel. A woman who practices prayer for protection against sleep paralysis also maintains regular sleep hygiene, takes prescribed anxiety medication, and avoids sleeping on her back, addressing the phenomenon through spiritual, medical, and behavioral means simultaneously. She doesn't see these as contradictory, but as addressing different aspects of her experience. The prayer brings comfort and spiritual protection. The medicine regulates neurotransmitters. The sleep position reduces triggering. All are true, all are useful. The question, which explanation is correct, increasingly seems like the wrong question to many experiencers. The better question might be, which framework helps me cope, reduces my suffering, allows me to navigate this frightening experience? From that pragmatic perspective, if prayer makes you feel safer and reduces the anxiety that triggers episodes, The prayer works regardless of whether its mechanism is supernatural intercession or psychological comfort. If understanding the neuroscience reduces your fear during episodes, that understanding works regardless of whether it's the complete explanation. This pragmatic pluralism frustrates both hardcore materialists and religious fundamentalists. Materialists insist that wrong explanations are harmful, even if they feel helpful. Religious fundamentalists worry that accepting scientific explanations undermines faith. But for many people living with sleep paralysis, the theoretical purity matters less than practical results. They'll use whatever tools reduce their suffering, whether those tools are blessed by science, religion, or both. The integration reflects broader cultural shift toward holding multiple frameworks for understanding complex phenomena. Perhaps the lesson of sleep paralysis is that human experience is rich enough to support multiple valid perspectives, that neuroscience and spirituality can both offer truth without requiring the other's elimination. The demons are in your neurons, and your prayers can help, and there's no contradiction in living with both realities simultaneously. Modern sleep scientists examining ancient treatments for sleep paralysis have made uncomfortable discoveries. Some of them actually work. Not because the theoretical frameworks were correct, the demons and humors and spiritual imbalances were imaginary, but because the practices accidentally stumbled onto genuinely effective interventions. The medieval sleeping position designed to prevent demon entry? It reduces sleep apnea incidents that can trigger sleep paralysis. The ancient Chinese bedroom orientation meant to confuse spirits. It minimizes light and noise exposure that disrupt sleep architecture. The Egyptian herbal preparation to ward off night crushers? It contains compounds with documented anxiolytic effects. Take the practice, common across multiple ancient cultures, of avoiding sleeping flat on your back. Medieval Europeans believed this position made you vulnerable to incubus attacks. Traditional Chinese medicine considered it energetically imbalanced. Various cultures developed elaborate supernatural justifications for preferring side sleeping. Modern research confirms that sleeping supine significantly increases sleep paralysis occurrence. The position affects breathing, makes sleep apnea more likely, and correlates with higher rates of REM-related disturbances. The ancients were empirically correct, even though their reasoning was wrong. Herbal preparations reveal similar patterns. Egyptian remedies included valerian, passion flower, and other plants now known to contain compounds affecting GABA receptors and promoting sleep quality. Greek physicians prescribed chamomile and lavender for sleep disturbances, both still recommended by modern herbalists and supported by research showing mild sedative effects. Chinese traditional formulas combined ingredients we now know affect cortisol levels, neurotransmitter balance, and circadian rhythm regulation. They weren't prescribing these because they understood biochemistry, but because generations of empirical observation showed they helped. The practice of maintaining regular sleep schedules, emphasized in various traditional medical systems, turns out to be perhaps the most effective intervention for sleep paralysis. Ayurvedic medicine stressed sleeping and waking at consistent times, aligned with natural cycles. Chinese medicine emphasized harmony with circadian rhythms. Medieval European monastic schedules maintained rigid sleep discipline. Modern chronobiology confirms that irregular sleep schedules are among the strongest predictors of sleep disturbances, including paralysis. Regular timing helps stabilize sleep architecture and reduces the transitions that trigger episodes. Environmental modifications recommended by ancient traditions often had practical value. The emphasis on dark, quiet, appropriately cool sleeping spaces appears across cultures. Islamic tradition emphasized cleanliness and tranquility in sleeping areas. Japanese practices focused on minimal, clean sleeping environments. European traditions stressed the importance of protected, peaceful bedchambers. All of these align with current sleep hygiene recommendations. The supernatural justifications were creative fiction, but the practices improved actual sleep quality. Breathing practices, taught in various traditions, for managing nocturnal disturbances, show remarkable sophistication. Yogic pranayama techniques for evening practice promote parasympathetic activation and anxiety reduction. Buddhist meditation practices emphasized awareness of breath and body relaxation. These weren't understood in terms of nervous system regulation, but that's precisely what they accomplish. Controlled breathing reduces the anxiety that exacerbates sleep paralysis and helps break the panic cycle when episodes occur. Even some seemingly absurd practices contained hidden wisdom. The medieval European practice of sleeping with certain stones or crystals under the pillow did nothing supernatural, but the ritual of preparing one's sleeping space mindfully, creating sense of safety and protection, likely reduced anxiety and improved sleep quality. The placebo effect is still an effect. If you believe you're protected and thus sleep more peacefully, the protection works through belief rather than magic, but works nonetheless. What ancient medicine lacked wasn't wisdom about what helped, but understanding of why it helped. They developed effective practices through trial and error across generations, preserving what worked and building elaborate explanatory frameworks to make sense of their observations. Modern science has the advantage of understanding mechanisms, but the ancients had the advantage of centuries of empirical testing in real-world conditions. Mining traditional practices for hidden insights, separating effective interventions from supernatural justifications, reveals that our ancestors weren't fools, but careful observers working with the tools and frameworks available to them. Their demons were imaginary, but their solutions were sometimes surprisingly real. The first question a sleep medicine physician asks someone reporting sleep paralysis is usually, how often? Occasional episodes affecting otherwise healthy people with good sleep habits rarely require intervention beyond reassurance and education. But when paralysis occurs frequently, causes significant distress, or interferes with daily functioning, the medical approach becomes more systematic. Sleep hygiene forms the foundation of treatment and often proves remarkably effective by itself. Maintain consistent sleep schedule, even on weekends. Aim for 7 to 9 hours nightly. Create dark, cool, quiet sleeping environment. Avoid screens for an hour before bed. The blue light disrupts melatonin production and delays sleep onset. Don't consume caffeine after early afternoon. Exercise regularly, but not close to bedtime. Avoid heavy meals in the evening. These recommendations sound simple, almost trivial, but adherence can reduce sleep paralysis episodes by 75% or more for many sufferers. Sleep position modification deserves special attention. The evidence is clear. Sleeping supine dramatically increases sleep paralysis risk. Teaching patients to sleep on their sides, sometimes using pillows or even devices that make back sleeping uncomfortable, can be transformative. Some sleep clinics recommend the tennis ball technique, sewing a tennis ball into the back of sleep clothing to make sleeping on your back impossible. It's low-tech but effective. For cases where sleep hygiene and position changes aren't sufficient, physicians investigate underlying conditions. Sleep apnea frequently coexists with sleep paralysis, and treating the apnea, usually with CPAP therapy, often resolves the paralysis as well. Narcolepsy presents with sleep paralysis as one of several symptoms, and treating the narcolepsy through medication and sleep management addresses the paralysis indirectly. Anxiety disorders require their own treatment, but reducing baseline anxiety typically reduces sleep paralysis frequency. Cognitive behavioral therapy has shown promise, particularly CBT adapted for insomnia and nightmares. The therapy helps patients develop healthier relationships to sleep, reduce anxiety about potential episodes, and learn techniques for managing the experience when it occurs. Mindfulness-based interventions teach awareness and acceptance rather than panic and resistance. The goal isn't eliminating episodes entirely, that's often not possible, but reducing their frequency and emotional impact. Medication is rarely first-line treatment for sleep paralysis alone, but may be prescribed when other interventions prove insufficient or when treating comorbid conditions. SSRIs and other antidepressants can suppress REM sleep and reduce episodes, though this is off-label use and comes with potential side effects. Tricyclic antidepressants have been tried with mixed results. Sleep medications that improve sleep consolidation might help indirectly, but benzodiazepines carry dependence risks that usually outweigh benefits. Some patients respond to melatonin supplementation, particularly when circadian rhythm disruption contributes to their symptoms. The dosing and timing matter enormously. Too much, taken at the wrong time, can worsen rather than improve sleep. Working with a physician or sleep specialist to find appropriate dosing is important. The emerging intervention showing promise is targeted sleep position training, using wearable devices that detect when the wearer shifts to supine position and deliver gentle vibration prompts to change position without fully waking. Early studies suggest this can reduce episodes without disrupting sleep quality. The technology is improving rapidly, and consumer devices may soon make this widely accessible. For severe cases resistant to other interventions, sleep medicine specialists might recommend polysomnography, an overnight sleep study to identify specific sleep architecture, abnormalities, or other sleep disorders contributing to paralysis. The detailed data can guide more targeted interventions. What's crucial in the modern medical approach is individualization. Sleep paralysis has multiple potential triggers and contributing factors. What works brilliantly for one patient may be irrelevant for another. The systematic approach tries interventions sequentially or in combination, monitors results, adjusts strategies based on patient response. It's detective work more than protocol application. Physicians also increasingly recognize the importance of validating the patient's experience. Sleep paralysis can be genuinely traumatic. Dismissing it as just a dream or minimizing the distress causes harm. Good clinical care involves acknowledging the terror the patient experiences, explaining the mechanisms clearly, and working collaboratively to find solutions that reduce both frequency and impact. The goal isn't just fewer episodes, but better quality of life for people living with this condition. Importantly, physicians now recognize that knowing the scientific explanation doesn't make the experience less frightening in the moment. Education helps, but it's not magic. Comprehensive treatment addresses both the physiological triggers and the psychological response, recognizing that mind and body aren't separate domains, but integrated system requiring integrated care. The moment of recognizing you're in sleep paralysis, rather than being attacked, offers a choice most people never consider. Instead of fighting the paralysis, what if you used it? A small but growing community of practitioners has developed techniques for transforming sleep paralysis from nightmare into tool, using the state as launching platform for lucid dreams, out-of-body experiences, or other altered consciousness states. They're not eliminating the experience but radically reframing their relationship to it. The technique starts with recognition. The panic response during sleep paralysis creates a vicious cycle. Fear increases stress hormone release, which intensifies the hallucinations and paralysis sensation. But if you can recognize the state for what it is, you can interrupt the panic cycle. Experienced practitioners train themselves to notice the signs: inability to move, sense of presence, characteristic breathing restriction. Instead of thinking, something is attacking me, they think, I'm in sleep paralysis. This is the state I've been practicing with. The next step is acceptance rather than resistance. Fighting the paralysis intensifies it. Trying to move amplifies frustration and fear. Instead, practitioners relax into the paralysis, acknowledging it without resistance. This psychological shift often reduces the threatening character of the experience almost immediately. The demon in the corner doesn't disappear, but it becomes less intensely malevolent when you're not radiating terror. Breath control becomes crucial. Sleep paralysis doesn't actually prevent breathing, but it feels like it does. Practitioners focus on slow, deliberate breathing, counting breaths, extending exhales, creating rhythm. This serves dual purpose. It activates parasympathetic nervous system, reducing fear response, and it provides concrete focus that prevents mind from spiraling into panic. With fear managed and breathing controlled, the transition technique varies based on goal. Those seeking lucid dreams use the partial consciousness of sleep paralysis as bridge. They imagine themselves in a specific dream scenario, visualizing details vividly while maintaining awareness. The transition from paralysis to controlled dream can be remarkably smooth because the brain is already in a liminal state between waking and dreaming. Others use sleep paralysis as entry point for what they describe as out-of-body experiences. The technique involves imagining yourself rolling out of your paralyzed body or floating upward. Practitioners report remarkably consistent sensations of separation, of existing outside their physical form. Whether this represents actual out-of-body experience or vivid hallucination triggered by the neurological state remains hotly debated, but the subjective experience is compelling enough to motivate continued practice. Research on whether reframing sleep paralysis reduces its traumatic impact shows promising results. Studies comparing individuals who interpret episodes as opportunities versus those who interpret them as attacks find significant differences in anxiety levels, episode-related distress, and overall quality of life. The neurological event might be identical, but the psychological relationship to it transforms the experience profoundly. However, the approach isn't universally successful and carries risks. For some people, attempting to induce or prolong sleep paralysis worsens anxiety and increases episode frequency. For those with trauma histories, particularly sexual trauma, the vulnerability of paralysis may be re-traumatizing regardless of cognitive reframing. Mental health professionals caution that this approach isn't appropriate for everyone and should be attempted carefully, ideally with therapeutic support. The online communities teaching these techniques emphasize gradual practice. Don't start by trying to transform your most terrifying episodes. Begin with education, visualization practice during normal waking, developing mental habits that might activate during actual episodes. Build skills slowly, expect setbacks. Not every episode will be successfully transformed, and that's acceptable. What this approach ultimately represents is radical reclaiming of agency. Sleep paralysis creates profound helplessness, trapped in your body, subject to terrifying hallucinations, unable to act. Transforming that state into intentional altered consciousness practice reverses the power dynamic. You're not victim of your neurology, but explorer of consciousness, using your brain's natural capacities. Whether the exploration leads anywhere real or simply provides psychological mastery over frightening experience, the result is transformation from passivity to agency, from terror to curiosity, from being haunted to being the conscious navigator of your own internal night. The demon sitting on your chest during sleep paralysis doesn't exist. We know this with scientific certainty. There's no entity in the room. The weight you feel is your own rib muscles under continuing REM breathing patterns. The presence you sense is your threat detection system misfiring. The malevolent intention you perceive is your brain's narrative construction attempting to make sense of anomalous neural activation. Everything you experience is generated internally, not perceived from external reality. Yet the experience feels utterly, completely, undeniably real. That gap between objective unreality and subjective reality opens directly onto philosophy's hardest problem. The hard problem of consciousness, articulated most famously by philosopher David Chalmers, asks, why does subjective experience feel like something? We can explain brain processes, neural correlations, information processing. We can map which circuits create which experiences. But we can't explain why those processes feel like anything from the inside. Why isn't it all just unconscious computation? Why is there an experiential quality to being conscious? Sleep paralysis, hallucinations make the problem visceral and unavoidable. You know the demon is hallucination. You understand the neuroscience. Yet the demon is there, as present as anything you've ever perceived. If your brain can create a presence so convincing it feels more real than reality, what does that tell us about everything else you experience? Every sight, sound, sensation you consider real is also constructed by your brain from electrical signals. The difference between hallucination and perception isn't that one is constructed and the other isn't. Both are constructed. The difference is that perception usually corresponds to external stimuli, while hallucination doesn't. But from inside your skull, you can't directly access external stimuli. You only ever experience your brain's reconstruction of them. The demon during sleep paralysis and the chair you're sitting on are both models built by your brain. One corresponds to reality, one doesn't. But the subjective experience of both is equally your brain creating sensory experience. In philosopher Anil Seth's framing, all perception is controlled hallucination. We hallucinate our reality into existence, and when our hallucinations match external reality sufficiently well, we call that perception rather than delusion. Sleep paralysis demonstrates this with brutal clarity. Your brain generates a presence. It assigns that presence, location, intention, sometimes appearance. It creates the felt sense of another consciousness near you. Every aspect of the experience is constructed from neural activity alone, yet it produces the same phenomenological quality as experiencing an actual person in the room. What does this reveal about the nature of all conscious experience? Phenomenologist Maurice Merleau-Ponty emphasized the primacy of embodied experience. We don't just think about our bodies, we exist as bodies in the world. Sleep paralysis violates this fundamental embodiment. Your body becomes prison rather than medium of being. The proprioceptive sense of where your body is and what it's doing conflicts with motor intentions. You exist in strange dissociation between consciousness that wants to move and body that won't respond. This breakdown of normal embodiment reveals how much our sense of self depends on smooth integration of sensory feedback, motor control, and conscious intention. The question becomes, if hallucinations can create such compelling realities, how do we justify trusting our experiences at all? Philosophers have wrestled with this for millennia. Descartes' evil demon, the brain in a vat, thought experiments, simulation hypotheses. Sleep paralysis isn't abstract philosophical puzzle, but lived experience of radical uncertainty about the reality status of perception. Most people resolve this pragmatically. We trust perceptions that cohere with each other, with other people's reports, with our ability to successfully navigate the world. But sleep paralysis reveals the contingency of that trust. Neuroscience can map exactly what's happening in the brain during sleep paralysis hallucinations. Philosophy asks what that tells us about consciousness itself. The answer seems to be that consciousness is stranger and more constructed than our everyday experience suggests. We don't passively receive reality but actively generate it, and under certain conditions, sleep paralysis being one of the most common, the generation continues without external input, creating experiences as real as anything we consider real. The demon is in your neurons, but your neurons are all you've ever had access to anyway. The hard problem isn't just explaining consciousness. It's accepting how little we can be certain about anything we experience, given that all experience is generated by mechanisms capable of creating utterly convincing unrealities. Millions of people across human history have reported being attacked by demons during sleep. The reports are detailed, consistent across cultures, describe similar entities and experiences. The witnesses are generally credible people, reporting in good faith what they genuinely experienced. In any other context, such widespread, consistent testimony would constitute substantial evidence that something was happening. Yet we dismiss these millions of experiences as hallucinations and consider the case closed. This raises uncomfortable questions about how we evaluate evidence for unusual phenomena. The standard scientific response is that we have better explanation. Neurological processes during sleep paralysis create these experiences without requiring actual demons. The simpler explanation that doesn't invoke supernatural entities is preferable by Occam's razor. This is sound methodology and almost certainly correct regarding sleep paralysis specifically. But it establishes a pattern. Subjective experiences, no matter how numerous or consistent, will be explained away by material processes whenever possible. The question is whether this pattern is entirely justified, or whether it sometimes dismisses genuine phenomena that don't fit materialist frameworks. Consider the historical pattern. Lightning was once attributed to gods. We now understand it as electrical discharge in atmospheric conditions. Disease was blamed on demons or divine punishment. We now know about pathogens and immune system dysfunction. Mental illness was seen as possession. We now understand neurotransmitter imbalances and neural circuit dysfunctions. Again and again, supernatural explanations have yielded to natural ones. This track record suggests that sleep paralysis demons joining the list of debunked supernatural claims is entirely appropriate. But does the pattern prove that all currently unexplained phenomena will eventually receive materialist explanations? Or does it just prove that humans incorrectly attributed many natural phenomena to supernatural causes? These aren't the same claim. The latter doesn't logically exclude the possibility that some phenomena might actually involve non-material realities currently beyond scientific investigation. The epistemological problem is that subjective experience is simultaneously the most certain thing we know. You cannot doubt that you're experiencing something while you're experiencing it, and the least reliable evidence for objective reality. Descartes built his entire philosophy on "I think, therefore I am," because subjective experience of thinking was the only thing he couldn't doubt. But he could doubt everything about the content of that thinking, including whether any external reality existed at all. Sleep paralysis sits exactly at this tension point. The experiencer cannot doubt they experienced something. The crushing weight, the presence, the terror, these were absolutely real as experiences. But the content of the experience, that there was actually a demon, can be doubted and is almost certainly wrong. So we have certainty about the fact of experience, combined with uncertainty about what the experience reveals regarding external reality. How do we appropriately weigh subjective reports? Science has developed rigorous methods: reproducibility, controlled conditions, objective measurement, peer review. These methods work brilliantly for publicly observable phenomena, but struggle with private, subjective experiences. We can measure brain activity during sleep paralysis. We can identify the neural correlates, but we can't directly access what it feels like from inside. We're left with testimony, which science treats as notoriously unreliable. Yet completely dismissing subjective reports creates its own problems. Consciousness itself is a subjective phenomenon. Pain, emotion, aesthetic experience, spiritual insight, these are irreducibly first-person phenomena. Demanding third-person objective verification for first-person experiences sets up an impossible standard. Sleep paralysis can be verified to occur, the REM atonia, the brain activation patterns are measurable, but the experiential content, the felt sense of presence and malevolence, remains accessible only through testimony. Perhaps the middle ground involves taking subjective experiences seriously as data about consciousness, while remaining skeptical about their implications for external reality. When millions of people report similar experiences, that tells us something important about human consciousness, brain architecture, and the conditions under which certain experiences arise. It doesn't necessarily tell us anything about demons. But here's the uncomfortable edge case. What if some small percentage of sleep paralysis cases actually involve genuine non-material phenomena? How would we know? If our methodological assumptions exclude the possibility from the start, we'd never detect it. The evidence would look identical to pure hallucination, because we'd interpret it that way regardless. This doesn't mean demons are real. It means our epistemological frameworks might be incapable of detecting certain types of phenomena, even if they existed. That limitation doesn't invalidate science. It just acknowledges that science, like all human endeavors, operates within assumptions that could theoretically be incomplete. The demons are almost certainly hallucinations. The almost is what philosophy won't let us escape. When you explain to someone experiencing sleep paralysis that their demon is just neurons, you might free them from supernatural terror, or you might invalidate the most profound experience of their life. The same explanation, opposite effects. The words haven't changed, the neuroscience hasn't changed. What varies is the person receiving the explanation, their needs, their frameworks for meaning, their relationship to their own experiences. This reveals something crucial. Explanations aren't neutral transmissions of truth, but interventions with power to help or harm. Research on explanatory models in medical anthropology shows that coherent frameworks for understanding illness improve psychological outcomes, regardless of whether the frameworks are objectively correct. A patient who believes their symptoms result from demonic attack but receives ritual healing from a trusted spiritual authority often shows measurable improvement. A patient who receives accurate medical diagnosis but doesn't understand or trust the explanation may experience worse outcomes. The coherence and cultural fit of the explanation matter enormously. This creates genuine ethical dilemma for clinicians treating sleep paralysis. The neurological explanation is accurate, evidence-based, and usually helpful. Most patients report relief upon learning that their experiences have natural explanation, aren't signs of mental illness or supernatural curse, and can be managed through practical interventions. But some patients experience the neurological explanation as dismissive, reductive, invalidating of their lived reality. "You're telling me it's just my brain," can feel like, "You're telling me it wasn't real. My terror doesn't matter. I'm making it up." The power dynamics compound the problem. The physician or sleep specialist holds institutional authority. Their explanations carry weight of medical establishment, scientific consensus, cultural legitimacy. When they tell you what your experience means, they're not just offering information but exercising power to define your reality. For patients from marginalized communities, religious minorities, or those whose worldviews differ from mainstream medical materialism, this can feel like cultural imposition rather than helpful care. Yet, withholding accurate medical information to avoid offending belief systems carries its own ethical problems. If neurological explanation and practical interventions can reduce suffering, doesn't the physician have obligation to provide them? The paternalistic medical model would say yes, the doctor knows best and should impose correct understanding. Contemporary medical ethics emphasizes patient autonomy and cultural competence, requiring physicians to navigate between providing evidence-based care and respecting diverse belief systems. Some practitioners have developed integrative approaches. They present the neurological explanation as one framework for understanding the experience, not necessarily contradicting spiritual interpretations, but offering additional perspective. They emphasize that understanding the mechanism doesn't negate the reality of the experience or the legitimacy of finding meaning through religious or spiritual lenses. They work within the patient's existing belief system where possible, finding interventions that make sense in that framework even if the justification differs from medical reasoning. The research on outcomes supports pluralistic approaches. Patients who maintain spiritual interpretations while also implementing evidence-based sleep hygiene practices often do better than those forced to choose between their beliefs and medical advice. The combination of meaning-making through religious framework and practical symptom management through behavioral changes addresses both psychological and physiological dimensions. But this pragmatic pluralism troubles both hardcore materialists and religious conservatives. Materialists argue that false beliefs are inherently harmful, that accommodating supernatural interpretations enables irrationality and prevents full acceptance of scientific understanding. Religious conservatives worry that validating scientific explanations undermines faith and opens doors to secular worldviews that threaten religious authority. Both sides want exclusive truth claims, rejection of the other framework. The people actually suffering from sleep paralysis often have more pragmatic concerns. They want relief. They want to sleep without terror. They want tools that work, regardless of theoretical purity. If prayer helps, they'll pray. If sleeping on their side helps, they'll do that too. The either-or battle between science and spirituality is often less relevant to them than finding whatever combination of approaches reduces their suffering. What this reveals is that explanation itself is intervention, not neutral description. How we frame experiences shapes how we relate to them, which shapes their ongoing impact on our lives. The neurological explanation of sleep paralysis is accurate and helpful for many. For others, it's incomplete or invalidating. The challenge is providing accurate information while respecting diverse frameworks for meaning-making. Offering evidence-based interventions while acknowledging that the map is not the territory, the mechanism is not the totality of the experience, and understanding what happens doesn't fully explain what it means. Sleep paralysis was an anomaly, a curiosity, something that happened to relatively few people with no obvious importance to understanding normal sleep. Then researchers realized it was a doorway into fundamental sleep architecture, a natural experiment revealing mechanisms that operated in everyone, but became visible only when something went wrong. What we learned by studying this disorder transformed our understanding of consciousness itself. The discovery of REM atonia came directly from investigating sleep paralysis experiences. Researchers needed to explain why people reported being unable to move during certain sleep disturbances. The answer that the brain actively paralyzes the body during REM sleep revealed a crucial protective mechanism operating every night in every sleeping person. Without this paralysis, we'd physically act out our dreams, potentially injuring ourselves or others. Sleep paralysis became the key that unlocked understanding of how the brain coordinates consciousness, states, and motor control. This led to mapping the specific neural circuits responsible for sleep-wake transitions. The ventrolateral periaqueductal gray, the sublaterodorsal nucleus, the connections between brainstem and spinal cord that trigger muscle atonia. These were identified through studying what happens when the system malfunctions. The broken lock revealed the key's shape. The failed transition illuminated the normal transition's mechanics. Sleep paralysis also provided crucial insights into how the brain generates sense of presence. The consistent reports across cultures of sensing an entity in the room during episodes led researchers to investigate which brain regions create this experience. They identified the temporoparietal junction's role in distinguishing self from other, the amygdala's contribution of emotional valence, and the integration of sensory information that constructs our moment-to-moment awareness of who and what occupies our space. These findings extended far beyond sleep paralysis, informing understanding of schizophrenia, autism, and normal social cognition. The hallucinations accompanying sleep paralysis became windows into how perception works generally. The brain doesn't passively receive sensory input, but actively predicts what it expects to perceive, then compares predictions against actual input. During sleep paralysis, the prediction system continues operating without normal sensory constraints, revealing its processes nakedly. This predictive processing framework, now central to neuroscience and artificial intelligence, was substantially informed by studying hallucinations during liminal consciousness states. Research into why sleep paralysis triggers specifically threatening presences rather than neutral or pleasant ones illuminated the brain's threat detection systems. The default assumption toward unfamiliar stimuli or ambiguous situations is potential threat, better to perceive danger that isn't there than miss danger that is. This negativity bias, evolutionarily adaptive, becomes visible in exaggerated form during sleep paralysis. Understanding this mechanism helped explain anxiety disorders, paranoia, and normal fear responses. The cultural variations in sleep paralysis interpretation became foundation for cultural neuroscience. The study of how culture shapes brain function and how brain function shapes culture. The identical neurological event producing different experiential content across cultures demonstrated that biology and culture aren't separate domains, but intimately intertwined. This influenced approaches to psychiatry, anthropology, and cognitive science. Sleep paralysis's relationship to narcolepsy opened understanding of sleep disorders more broadly. Narcolepsy involves dysregulation of the same sleep-wake transition systems that malfunction in sleep paralysis. Studying one condition illuminated the other, leading to improved diagnosis and treatment for both. The research revealed that sleep isn't simply on-off switch, but complex system of multiple states that can become desynchronized in various ways. Perhaps most profoundly, sleep paralysis helped establish that consciousness isn't unitary. You can be conscious in your mind while unconscious in your body. You can be aware while dreaming, asleep while partially awake, paralyzed while alert. The normal boundaries we assume between different consciousness states are more fluid and complex than everyday experience suggests. This understanding influenced everything from meditation research to anesthesia studies to theories of consciousness itself. A phenomenon that affected relatively few people, that was often dismissed as mere nightmare or spiritual delusion, became central to understanding how all human brains manage the transitions between waking and sleeping, between consciousness and unconsciousness, between self and world. The broken system taught us how the working system operates. The techniques developed to help people manage sleep paralysis turned out to be useful far beyond their original application. When researchers taught sleep paralysis sufferers to recognize they were in an episode, remain calm, and ride out the experience rather than panic, they accidentally developed protocols that worked for other intrusive experiences. The cognitive strategies, the breathing techniques, the reframing approaches, these migrated across conditions in unexpected ways. PTSD patients suffering from traumatic nightmares found that the same recognition and reframing techniques reduced their nightmare frequency and intensity. The core skill was identical, recognizing that what you're experiencing isn't current reality, maintaining awareness during the experience, and managing fear response rather than being overwhelmed by it. The military and VA medical systems incorporated sleep paralysis management techniques into nightmare rescripting therapy, with measurable improvements in veterans' sleep quality and PTSD symptoms. Panic disorder treatment borrowed heavily from sleep paralysis research. Both involve catastrophic misinterpretation of bodily sensations. The paralyzed person interpreting inability to move as demonic attack, the panic disorder patient interpreting rapid heartbeat as impending heart attack. Cognitive behavioral therapy for panic disorder uses techniques nearly identical to those developed for sleep paralysis. Recognize the sensation, understand it's not dangerous, practice staying calm rather than fleeing. The success rates for both conditions improved through cross-pollination of treatment approaches. Research into cultural aspects of sleep paralysis profoundly influenced cultural psychiatry. The recognition that identical neurological events could be experienced and interpreted completely differently across cultures challenged simplistic biological models of mental illness. It demonstrated that diagnosis and treatment must account for cultural frameworks, that Western psychiatric categories aren't universal, and that healing practices from various traditions might offer valuable insights even when their theoretical frameworks differ from Western medicine. This led to more culturally competent mental health care and greater respect for indigenous healing traditions. The study of hallucinations during sleep paralysis informed schizophrenia research and treatment. Both involve the brain generating perceptions without external stimuli, and both are powerfully influenced by cultural context. Understanding how non-psychotic individuals experiencing sleep paralysis could have utterly convincing hallucinations helped reduce stigma around psychotic hallucinations. It also suggested that some approaches to managing sleep paralysis, hallucinations, acceptance, reduced distress, continuing function despite the experiences might benefit people with schizophrenia who hear voices or have visions. Sleep paralysis research contributed to understanding obsessive-compulsive disorder through its insights into intrusive thoughts and the relationship between thought and action. The paralyzed person's experience of intention without ability to act illuminated the normal integration of thought, intention, and action. When that integration breaks down, as in OCD, where intrusive thoughts feel threatening and require compulsive responses, understanding the mechanism helps develop interventions. Exposure and response prevention therapy for OCD parallels sleep paralysis management. Experience the intrusive element without responding to it. Prove to yourself it's not dangerous through direct experience. The meditation and mindfulness practices that proved helpful for managing sleep paralysis drew attention from researchers studying contemplative practices more broadly. The techniques sleep paralysis sufferers developed for maintaining awareness during altered states paralleled what experienced meditators cultivated deliberately. This cross-fertilization benefited both fields. Meditation research informed sleep paralysis treatment, while sleep paralysis management techniques were incorporated into mindfulness-based interventions for various conditions. Perhaps most unexpectedly, sleep paralysis research influenced anesthesia science. The state of being conscious while unable to move had terrible relevance to anesthesia awareness. The nightmare scenario where surgical patients wake during procedures but cannot signal their awareness. Understanding the brain mechanisms that allow consciousness without motor function helped anesthesiologists develop better monitoring and protocols to prevent awareness while maintaining adequate paralysis during surgery. The broader lesson was that human neurology isn't compartmentalized. The circuits involved in sleep paralysis participate in multiple functions. The psychological strategies that help with one condition often transfer to others. The cultural frameworks that shape interpretation of unusual experiences influence all health-seeking behavior. Medical knowledge doesn't advance in neat silos, but through unexpected connections, cross-pollination of ideas, and recognition that the human brain and mind are integrated systems, where insights in one area illuminate many others. Sleep paralysis became the perfect natural experiment for cultural psychology because it offered something rare, a consistent biological phenomenon experienced across all human populations, but interpreted through wildly different cultural lenses. Same brain, same mechanisms, completely different meanings. This made it invaluable for studying how culture shapes not just interpretation but actual subjective experience. Researchers could compare sleep paralysis experiences across cultures and identify what remained constant versus what varied. The paralysis itself was universal. The sense of presence appeared everywhere. But whether that presence felt demonic, ancestral, neutral, or even potentially helpful, varied systematically with cultural frameworks. This demonstrated that culture doesn't just provide post hoc explanations for experiences, but shapes the experiences themselves in real time. The findings challenged strict biological determinism in psychiatry and neuroscience. If identical brain states could feel terrifying in one culture and merely unusual in another, then psychological outcomes weren't determined solely by neurology. Cultural context, belief systems, and meaning-making frameworks had measurable effects on how neurological events were experienced and whether they became pathological or manageable. This supported the biopsychosocial model of health and illness. The research influenced how anthropologists and historians interpreted historical accounts of supernatural experiences. Records of demonic possession, spiritual visitations, and nocturnal attacks could now be understood as potentially describing sleep paralysis and related phenomena filtered through period-appropriate cultural frameworks. This didn't reduce historical accounts to just sleep paralysis, but enriched understanding of how people made sense of their experiences and how those experiences shaped belief systems, social structures, and cultural practices. Religious studies scholars used sleep paralysis research to examine mystical and spiritual experiences more broadly. The question wasn't whether spiritual experiences were real, but how altered consciousness states, whether induced by sleep phenomena, meditation, substances, or other means, were interpreted and integrated into religious frameworks. The findings suggested that mystical experiences across traditions might share more neurological commonality than theological differences would suggest, even while meaning and significance varied enormously. Art and literature scholars recognized sleep paralysis themes running through cultural production across history. The night hag appears in paintings, poetry, and folklore worldwide. Recognition of the underlying experience added dimension to interpreting these works. They weren't merely imaginative creations, but efforts to represent and make sense of genuine, terrifying experiences that artists and writers had likely themselves endured or witnessed in others. The research contributed to understanding of culture-bound syndromes, conditions that appear primarily or exclusively in specific cultural contexts. Sleep paralysis demonstrated that the same biological phenomenon could become a recognized syndrome in some cultures while remaining virtually unnamed in others. This raised questions about whether some culture-bound syndromes might be cultural interpretations of universal experiences rather than genuinely culture-specific conditions. Educational psychology incorporated insights about how cultural expectations shape perception and experience. If sleep paralysis, hallucinations could be molded by cultural priming, what else might be influenced by expectations and frameworks students brought to learning? The findings supported culturally responsive pedagogy and awareness of how cultural background shapes not just what students know, but how they experience learning itself. The legal system even drew on sleep paralysis research in cases involving testimony about supernatural experiences or unusual perceptual events. Understanding that otherwise credible witnesses could genuinely experience vivid hallucinations that felt utterly real informed how courts evaluated certain types of testimony, particularly in cases where sleep paralysis might explain reported experiences. What began as investigation of a frightening sleep disorder became lens through which to examine the intricate relationships between biology, culture, psychology, and society. Sleep paralysis revealed that human experience isn't simply biological fact plus cultural interpretation, but rather emerges from their inseparable interaction. The lesson extended far beyond sleep disorders into fundamental questions about what it means to be conscious, cultural beings whose neurology shapes culture and whose culture shapes neurology in continuous feedback loop. In sleep laboratories across the world, researchers are watching sleep paralysis happen in real time at a resolution previous generations couldn't imagine. Functional MRI machines track blood flow to specific brain regions during episodes. EEG arrays with hundreds of electrodes map electrical activity with millisecond precision. The data is transforming understanding from general mechanisms to exact circuit-level detail. One research team at Harvard has successfully induced sleep paralysis in volunteers using carefully timed sleep disruption protocols. By controlling when participants are awakened during REM sleep cycles, they can trigger episodes under laboratory conditions with surprising reliability. This allows controlled study of a phenomenon that typically occurs unpredictably. The researchers monitor brain activity before, during, and after episodes, identifying the precise neural signatures that distinguish sleep paralysis from normal REM sleep or waking. What they're finding challenges some assumptions. The threat detection system activation that creates sense of presence isn't uniform across all sufferers, Some people show massive amygdala activation during episodes. These tend to experience the most intense fear and threatening hallucinations. Others show relatively modest amygdala response. They experience the paralysis and presence, but with less terror. This suggests genetic or developmental factors might influence how threatening the experience becomes, opening possibilities for identifying who is most vulnerable to traumatic episodes. Genetic research has identified several candidate genes associated with sleep paralysis susceptibility. Studies of twins and families show hereditary patterns, and genome-wide association studies are narrowing down specific genetic variants that increase risk. The genes involved relate to REM sleep regulation, GABA receptor function, and circadian rhythm control. Understanding genetic factors might eventually allow prediction of who will experience frequent episodes and enable early intervention before the condition becomes severe. The gut microbiome has emerged as an unexpected factor. Research shows that individuals with certain gut bacterial compositions experience sleep disturbances, including sleep paralysis at higher rates. The mechanism appears to involve the gut-brain axis microbiome composition, affects neurotransmitter production and inflammatory signaling that influence sleep architecture. Clinical trials testing whether targeted probiotic interventions can reduce sleep paralysis are underway, with preliminary results showing promise for some patients. Advanced sleep tracking technology is revealing patterns invisible to earlier research. Wearable devices that monitor sleep stages, movement, heart rate, and breathing continuously across weeks or months are identifying triggers and warning signs. Machine learning algorithms analyzing this data can predict with surprising accuracy when someone is likely to experience an episode based on recent sleep patterns, stress levels, and other variables. This prediction capability could enable preventive interventions, prompting position change or gentle arousal before paralysis fully sets in. Researchers are also investigating the neural basis of why certain imagery appears during sleep paralysis. Brain imaging during episodes, while subjects report their hallucinations, is revealing which cortical areas generate specific types of presences. The finding that similar brain activation patterns produce similar hallucinations across subjects suggests that the content isn't random, but follows from the architecture of visual and social cognition systems. This might explain cross-cultural consistencies in sleep paralysis imagery, despite diverse interpretative frameworks. The relationship between sleep paralysis and lucid dreaming is being mapped in detail. Both involve unusual consciousness states, with mixed features of sleeping and waking. Researchers have identified that people who frequently experience one often experience the other, suggesting shared neural mechanisms. Understanding this connection might allow development of techniques for consciously navigating between states, potentially transforming sleep paralysis into gateway for controlled lucid dreaming. Virtual reality is being used to help people prepare for sleep paralysis experiences. Patients practice coping strategies while experiencing simulated paralysis and threatening presences in safe, controlled VR environments. Early results suggest this exposure therapy approach reduces fear and improves management during actual episodes. The technology might eventually allow people to rehearse specific scenarios and develop confidence in their ability to handle the experience. Neurofeedback techniques showing subjects their own brain activity in real time are being tested as intervention. The goal is to train people to recognize their brain state during sleep paralysis and potentially influence it through attention and relaxation. It's early-stage research, but some subjects report gaining sense of control they didn't have before. What's striking about current research is both its precision and its acknowledgement of what remains unknown. We can see exactly which neurons fire, measure exactly which chemicals are involved, but predicting who will experience episodes or preventing them entirely remains challenging. The frontier keeps expanding, revealing both answers and new questions in equal measure. Some researchers are asking questions that make their colleagues uncomfortable. In published papers and conference presentations, they report findings that don't fit neatly into standard neurological models of sleep paralysis. The data deserves examination, even when the implications are unsettling. Consider the phenomenon of shared sleep paralysis experiences. Multiple reports exist of people sleeping in the same room, experiencing simultaneous episodes with remarkably similar features, sensing the same entity, describing identical imagery, waking at the same moment. Standard explanation suggests one person woke, made noise or movement that triggered the other's awakening, and later conversation conflated separate experiences. But some cases resist this explanation. The experiencers report no communication until afterward, describe details they couldn't have shared, and show genuine distress that feels qualitatively different from confabulation. A research group studying these cases has documented several dozen instances where the details strain coincidence explanations. They're not claiming supernatural forces, but suggesting that perhaps some sleep paralysis episodes involve environmental triggers, infrasound, electromagnetic fields, other physical factors that affect multiple people simultaneously and shape hallucination content through mechanisms not yet understood. The work is controversial because it edges toward validating experiences that most scientists dismiss outright. Research on near-death experiences overlaps uncomfortably with sleep paralysis studies. Both involve similar brain states. Some near-death experiences may actually be sleep paralysis occurring during medical crises. The out-of-body sensations, the presence of entities, the emotional intensity all map onto sleep paralysis features. But some near-death researchers claim this doesn't fully explain all reports, particularly cases where clinically dead patients describe accurate details about resuscitation efforts they shouldn't have been conscious to witness. Sleep paralysis research contributes to this debate by showing how convincing neurologically generated experiences can be, but also how much we still don't understand about consciousness during extreme states. The hard problem of consciousness gets harder in sleep paralysis context. Philosopher David Chalmers and others use sleep paralysis as evidence that subjective experience can't be fully reduced to physical brain processes. If the feeling of presence is entirely generated by neural circuits, why does it feel like experiencing actual presence rather than merely experiencing neural activation? The explanatory gap between physical processes and subjective experience seems especially stark when the subjective experience is so convincing yet objectively empty. Some researchers are investigating whether consciousness during sleep paralysis might sometimes operate with unusual independence from the body. This edges toward dualism, the controversial position that mind and brain aren't identical. Most neuroscientists reject dualism as unnecessary given materialist explanations, but a small minority suggests that sleep paralysis, lucid dreaming, and other altered states might provide evidence for consciousness, having properties not entirely determined by neural activity. The research is marginal, often published in journals the mainstream considers questionable, but the questions being asked are genuinely philosophical. Psychedelic research has created new context for understanding sleep paralysis. Substances like DMT produce experiences remarkably similar to sleep paralysis: hallucinations, entity encounters, profound presence, sense of accessing other realms. The experiences feel utterly real, despite being chemically induced. Some researchers suggest that sleep paralysis and psychedelics might access similar consciousness states through different mechanisms, raising questions about whether these states reveal aspects of consciousness normally hidden. This doesn't mean the entities are literally real, but it suggests consciousness might have features that emerge only in unusual conditions. The speculation that artificial intelligence or brain-computer interfaces might eventually allow recording or transmitting sleep paralysis experiences raises profound questions. If we could directly capture what sleep paralysis feels like and show it to others, what would we learn? Would it remain purely neurological or reveal features we currently can't detect? The technology doesn't exist yet, but theorizing about it illuminates the limits of current understanding. These controversial questions don't overturn standard explanations of sleep paralysis. The neurological model remains robust and well-evidenced, but they suggest that even well-understood phenomena can harbor mysteries, that the boundaries of current knowledge deserve testing, and that maintaining scientific openness to anomalous findings, while demanding rigorous evidence, serves the advancement of understanding better than premature certainty about what must be true. The device looks unremarkable, a soft headband with embedded sensors, indistinguishable from dozens of sleep-tracking gadgets already on the market. But the technology inside represents a potential revolution in managing sleep paralysis. It monitors sleep stages through EEG, tracks movement through accelerometers, and analyzes breathing patterns through pressure sensors. When it detects the distinctive signature of sleep paralysis onset, REM brain patterns combined with awakening indicators, while muscles remain paralyzed, it responds. The response can be tailored to individual preferences. Some users choose gentle vibration that increases gradually until they fully wake, ending the episode before terror sets in. Others select subtle audio cues, designed to pull consciousness toward full waking without jarring disruption. The most sophisticated versions attempt to influence the experience without ending it, using targeted audio or haptic feedback to reduce fear response while maintaining the state potentially useful for those trying to transition into lucid dreams. Early testing shows promise. Users report fewer episodes progressing to full terror, increased sense of control, and reduced anticipatory anxiety about sleep. The technology isn't preventing sleep paralysis, but changing the relationship to it, providing intervention exactly when needed most. Commercial versions are in development, with expected market release within 2 years. Advanced neuroimaging technologies coming online will revolutionize research. Ultra-high-field MRI machines with unprecedented resolution will map brain activity during sleep paralysis at the level of neural assemblies rather than just large regions. This granular data will reveal which specific circuits activate in which sequence, potentially identifying intervention points for preventing cascading activation that creates full-blown, terrifying episodes. Optogenetics using light to control genetically modified neurons with precision remains largely experimental in humans, but shows extraordinary potential. If we can identify exactly which neurons trigger REM atonia and which generate sense of presence, we might eventually be able to modulate these selectively. The technology raises profound ethical questions about whether we should intervene so directly in brain function. But for people whose lives are devastated by frequent, terrifying episodes, the prospect of precise neural control is compelling. Artificial intelligence applications are expanding rapidly. Machine learning algorithms trained on vast datasets of sleep patterns, genetic information, environmental factors, and episode reports can identify predictive patterns too subtle for human analysis. These AI systems might eventually provide personalized risk assessments and prevention strategies tailored to individual biology and circumstances. The algorithms could run on wearable devices, providing real-time guidance on sleep timing, positioning, and environmental optimization. Virtual reality technology is advancing toward untethered, comfortable systems suitable for sleep use. Imagine VR that activates when it detects sleep paralysis onset, overlaying calming imagery on your visual field, replacing the threatening hallucination with something neutral or pleasant. The technology would work with your brain's tendency to generate imagery, rather than fighting it, redirecting the hallucination content toward less frightening forms. It's speculative but potentially feasible within a decade. Brain-computer interfaces are being developed that might eventually allow communication during sleep paralysis. The locked-in state of sleep paralysis resembles certain neurological conditions where patients are conscious but unable to move or speak. Technologies being developed for those conditions, detecting intended movement from brain signals, translating thoughts into text, might apply to sleep paralysis. Being able to signal, "I'm okay, this is sleep paralysis, it will pass," during an episode could reduce panic for both sufferers and concerned partners. The most ambitious research envisions closed-loop systems that monitor brain state and deliver precisely timed interventions to prevent sleep paralysis before it starts. By detecting the earliest signs of REM sleep disruption and delivering targeted stimulation, perhaps through transcranial magnetic stimulation or other non-invasive neuromodulation, the system might guide the brain through transitions, without triggering paralysis. The technology requires much more research, but represents the ultimate goal, not just managing sleep paralysis, but preventing it entirely. These technologies promise to transform sleep paralysis from uncontrollable terror to manageable condition to potentially preventable phenomenon. But they also raise questions about intervention in natural brain states, medicalization of experiences that might have meaning beyond pathology, and whether we should eliminate sleep paralysis or learn to navigate it. The future will likely involve both technological solutions and renewed appreciation for the mysteries of consciousness that sleep paralysis reveals. For thousands of years, humans fought demons in the night. We carved protective symbols, recited prayers, burned herbs, positioned beds according to sacred principles, developed elaborate rituals to ward off entities that came when we were most vulnerable. We were wrong about the demons. They came from within, generated by our own neural circuits during transitions between consciousness states. But we were right about the terror being real, about the need for explanation, about the drive to transform helplessness into agency. That paradox being profoundly wrong in specifics, while being fundamentally right about the importance of the experience, reveals something essential about human nature. We are meaning-making creatures. When confronted with experiences that terrify and confuse us, we create frameworks to make them comprehensible. The frameworks don't have to be correct to serve their purpose. Medieval demonology was elaborate, systematic, internally consistent, and entirely wrong about the causes of sleep paralysis. Yet, it provided communities with shared language for the experience, protocols for response, and restoration of some sense of control over terrifying phenomena. The modern neurological framework is more accurate, but serves similar functions, providing explanation, suggesting interventions, reducing the experience from incomprehensible supernatural assault to manageable medical condition. The journey from demons to neurons demonstrates how human understanding evolves, but not always in straightforward progression. The path wasn't steady march from ignorance to knowledge, but zigzag of insights, setbacks, wrong turns that taught valuable lessons, and sometimes rediscovery of wisdom that had been lost. Ancient physicians who prescribed certain sleeping positions were right for wrong reasons. Medieval authorities who burned people as witches were catastrophically wrong. Modern science that can map every neuron involved still can't fully explain why the experience feels the way it does. Each framework captured some truth while missing other dimensions. Sleep paralysis reveals the intimate relationship between biology and culture. The neurological event is universal, hardwired into human sleep architecture, consistent across time and geography. But the experience of that event is profoundly shaped by cultural expectations, belief systems, and interpretative frameworks. The same brain state feels like demonic attack in one context, ancestral visitation in another, medical condition in a third. Culture doesn't just provide post hoc explanation, it shapes the subjective quality of the experience itself, influencing what we perceive, how intensely we feel it, and whether it becomes traumatic or manageable. This interplay between universal biology and cultural specificity appears throughout human experience. We all have bodies that function through identical biological processes, yet what we experience through those bodies varies enormously based on cultural conditioning, personal history, and interpretative frameworks we've absorbed. Sleep paralysis is a particularly clear example because the biological event is so distinct and the cultural variations so dramatic, but the principle applies broadly. Being human means existing at intersection of evolutionary biology and cultural creation. The thousands of years humans spent attributing sleep paralysis to supernatural forces weren't wasted, even though the explanations were wrong. Those millennia of collective experience, observation, and response generated knowledge about what helped and what didn't. Much of it was useless or harmful, but some interventions worked despite being justified by incorrect theories. Modern sleep science has validated certain ancient practices while explaining their mechanisms differently. The wisdom was embedded in the practices, not the theories. Perhaps most importantly, sleep paralysis demonstrates the limits of explanation itself. We can map the neural circuits, measure the neurotransmitters, explain the evolutionary reasons for REM atonia, trace the cultural history of interpretation. Yet the experience remains mysterious in a fundamental way. Why does consciousness feel like anything? Why is subjective experience so convincing, even when objectively empty? Why do we generate specifically malevolent presences rather than neutral ones? The explanatory gap between mechanism and meaning persists. This should make us humble about other aspects of human experience we don't yet understand. Our current scientific frameworks are almost certainly incomplete. Just as medieval demonology was incomplete, just as ancient humoral theory was incomplete. We know more than our ancestors, but future generations will likely know vastly more than we do. The trajectory suggests that human understanding continues evolving, and confidence about having achieved final answers on any topic is probably misplaced. Sleep paralysis taught us that demons could be neurons, that supernatural explanations could yield to natural ones, that the terrifying could be rendered manageable through understanding. But it also taught us that understanding the mechanism doesn't eliminate the mystery, that some questions remain even when we've answered all the subsidiary questions, and that being human means living with ambiguity about our own consciousness. We understand more about sleep than any previous generation, yet we sleep worse than almost any society in human history. The average person in developed nations sleeps 90 minutes less per night than a century ago. We've extended the day with artificial light, filled the hours before sleep with screens emitting blue wavelength, radiation that suppresses melatonin, created economies that demand 24-hour availability, normalized chronic sleep deprivation as badge of productivity. Then we wonder why sleep disorders, including sleep paralysis, seem increasingly prevalent. Modern life creates nearly optimal conditions for triggering sleep paralysis. Irregular sleep schedules? Check. Sleep deprivation? Widespread. High stress and anxiety? Epidemic levels. Screen exposure before bed disrupting circadian rhythms? Universal behavior. Backsleeping encouraged by certain mattress marketing? Common. We've essentially created an environment designed to maximize the exact factors that increase sleep paralysis occurrence, then pathologize the predictable results. The content of sleep paralysis hallucinations has evolved with cultural fears. Medieval Europeans saw demons and witches. Contemporary sufferers report intruders, shadow people, sometimes aliens. The threatening presence adapts to available cultural imagery. In an age of home security concerns, surveillance anxiety, and alien abduction narratives disseminated through media, the brain draws from this material when constructing its hallucinations. We've replaced demons with home invaders, but the function creating threatening entity during threat detection system activation remains constant. Social media has created new relationship to sleep paralysis. Sufferers can find community, share experiences, normalize what once felt isolating. But the constant exposure to others' terrifying accounts might also prime expectations, potentially shaping what people experience during their own episodes. The feedback loop between collective discourse and individual neurology operates in real time through digital networks, creating cultural neurological interactions that would have been impossible in previous eras. The medicalization of sleep paralysis represents both progress and loss. Modern medicine offers evidence-based interventions, reduces stigma by framing it as medical condition rather than spiritual failing, provides treatment that can genuinely help. But it also strips the experience of meaning beyond pathology. The spiritual or philosophical dimensions that some people find in sleep paralysis, questions about consciousness, reality, the boundaries of self, get reduced to symptoms requiring treatment. Some people experience this medicalization as liberation, others as impoverishment. Our secular, rationalized culture removes traditional frameworks for integrating unusual experiences. When sleep paralysis happened in a context of shared belief in spirits or demons, communities had established responses, rituals, meanings. Modern individuals experiencing sleep paralysis often have only the medical framework available, and if that feels insufficient for capturing the significance of their experience, they're left without culturally validated alternatives. Some turn to online communities, New Age spirituality, or personal meaning-making, but these lack the communal and traditional authority of older systems. The economic pressure toward productivity, maximizing sleep, polyphasic schedules, sleep hacking, efficiency optimization, treats sleep as problem to be solved rather than natural process to be respected. This instrumental relationship to sleep may increase disruptions. Ironically, those trying hardest to optimize sleep through rigid protocols and constant monitoring sometimes create the anxiety and pressure that degrades sleep quality and increases sleep paralysis risk. Yet positive developments exist. Public awareness of sleep's importance for health is growing. Technology enables better sleep tracking and personalized interventions. Online communities provide support and information, access impossible in previous eras. The destigmatization of sleep disorders means more people seek help rather than suffering silently. Scientific understanding advances rapidly, bringing hope for better treatments. What's needed is integration. combining modern medical understanding with respect for the experiential dimensions of sleep paralysis, using technology wisely without becoming enslaved to it, maintaining healthy sleep practices despite cultural pressures towards sleep deprivation, finding meaning frameworks that work for individuals while staying grounded in evidence. The challenge is being modern, using scientific knowledge and technological tools while remaining human in recognizing that sleep, consciousness, and unusual experiences carry significance beyond what purely mechanistic frameworks capture. Our ancestors had the meaning but wrong mechanisms. We have the mechanisms but struggle with meaning. Perhaps the future involves holding both. We've traveled from ancient Mesopotamia to modern neuroscience, from demon possession to REM-atonia, from witch trials to sleep laboratories. We've explained the unexplainable. We can map the exact neurons that fire when you sense a presence in your room. We understand why the crushing sensation happens, why you can't move, why the hallucinations feel utterly real. We've demystified what terrified our ancestors for millennia. But here's what we haven't lost: the sense that consciousness itself remains the deepest mystery we carry into the night. Understanding the mechanism doesn't eliminate wonder, it transforms it. Knowing that your brain creates the demon doesn't make the brain's capacity to create convincing realities any less astonishing. The demon is in your neurons, generated by circuits that evolved over millions of years to keep you safe by detecting threats. Your terror is the product of neurotransmitter cascades and activation patterns in the amygdala. This knowledge should be comforting, and for many people it is, but it's also deeply strange when you sit with it. You are a biological system, capable of constructing realities so convincing they feel more real than reality. Perhaps the lesson isn't choosing between supernatural and scientific explanations, but recognizing that different questions require different frameworks. If you want to know why you can't move during sleep paralysis, neuroscience provides precise answers. If you're seeking meaning in the experience, asking what it reveals about consciousness or your relationship to fear or the nature of reality itself, science offers valuable perspectives, but doesn't exhaust the relevant frameworks. Philosophy, spirituality, personal reflection, these approach different dimensions of the same experience. We can function effectively without complete understanding. Humanity thrived for millennia without knowing about REM-atonia, and individuals manage sleep paralysis successfully using techniques from diverse traditions. The demand for total explanation before taking action would paralyze us more completely than any sleep disorder. We can acknowledge uncertainty while still making informed choices about how to respond to our experiences. Mystery isn't the enemy of knowledge. Mystery is what remains when we've learned everything we currently can and recognize that more lies beyond. Sleep paralysis has been extensively studied, yet new questions continue emerging. Why do some people never experience it, while others suffer frequent episodes? Why does the brain default to malevolent rather than neutral presences? How exactly does cultural conditioning shape the content of neurologically generated hallucinations? These questions have partial answers, but the full picture eludes us. The wise approach might be holding multiple frameworks simultaneously without requiring them to reduce to single master narrative. The neuroscience is true. This is how sleep paralysis works mechanistically. The cultural psychology is true interpretation, shapes experience profoundly. The phenomenology is true. The subjective experience has qualities not fully captured by objective description. The spiritual dimensions some people find are true for them, meaning emerges through engagement with experiences, not just mechanical explanation of them. All these truths can coexist. Living with sleep paralysis, or studying it, or simply contemplating what it reveals about human consciousness, means accepting that we're simultaneously explained and mysterious, mechanical and meaningful, products of evolutionary biology and creators of culture that transcends biology. We are the animals who can map our own neural circuits while still being terrorized by what those circuits produce. We can explain ourselves while remaining, in fundamental ways, inexplicable to ourselves. The demons were always in our neurons, but our neurons are more mysterious than any demons our ancestors imagined. They generate consciousness, create reality, construct meaning, feel terror and wonder. Understanding them is science. Wondering at them is philosophy. living with their quirks, their glitches, their capacity to trap us in our own minds. That's the human condition. So when you wake at 3 in the morning, unable to move, sensing something in the darkness, you can know with scientific certainty what's happening in your brain. You can use evidence-based techniques to manage the experience. You can understand it's temporary, not dangerous, a glitch in sleep-wake transitions. But you can also recognize you're experiencing something profound about consciousness itself, the strangeness of being aware, of existence feeling like something, of being trapped inside a system that is both you and beyond your control. That's not supernatural. It's stranger than supernatural. It's being human.